All right, hey everyone. I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for being here. And sorry, we're starting a few minutes late. I know people are still trickling in. I'm Amrith. I'm the moderator for today. I'm the tech policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. My goal is to talk as little as possible and let you hear from our experts. This topic is super important. I think it's the best panel of the day. Personally, I'm a little biased, but it affects everyone. Everyone's using AI chatbots, and their impact on mental health and all of us is something that's really fascinating and something we all need to learn more about, frankly. So we'll start with intros and then dive into some topics, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions, and I have a mic here that can be passed around. So yeah, like I said, I'm Amrith. I'll do my intro first. Tech policy reporter at the Wall Street Journal, write a lot about AI, chips, various topics, and yeah, really excited to be here. Amina, over to you.
Hi, my name is Amina Fazula. I'm head of tech policy advocacy at Common Sense Media. And I will just pass it over to Amanda.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Amanda Lenhart. I am a senior fellow at the Joan Gans Cooney Center at the Sesame Workshop, which for those who don't know is an innovation lab inside a Sesame Workshop. I just also want to say I don't speak for the Sesame creatives today, just for the center. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Adam Thier. I'm a senior fellow at the R Street Institute here in Washington. I've been covering emerging technology policy here in town for 34 years now at a variety of different academic institutions and think tanks. Nice to be here again.
And I'm Shay Gardner, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy and Research for LGBT Tech. If you don't know of us, we're a national nonprofit that fights for digital equity for members of the LGBTQ+ community. So thank you.
Cool. Before we get into policy and legal implications and what should be done here, let's start with just each of you. What's one or two trends? Like, what are the basic facts I should know about AI chatbot usage and how they're impacting mental health in different communities? And it can be a stat, it could be an anecdote, up to you. Dealer's choice.
So Common Sense Media has been doing some research and also AI assessments into AI products. Our research team last year released research that showed that about 70%, over 70% of teens were using advanced AI chatbots for companionship, and that about 50% of them were regular users, about 30% preferred engaging with the chatbot as much or more than other humans. We've also done research into sort of the awareness of parents into their children's AI usage, which you can guess is pretty low. And so I think that's some good ground setting to understand, yes, these products are used by kids. Yes, they're using it for AI companionship, not just to answer a question for school. And in addition to companionship, we're finding that there are often many, many questions related to mental health as well.
I'm going to go next. Thanks, Amina. As probably the researcher on the panel, or one of the researchers on the panel, I actually did some of the work that Amina is talking about back when I was at Common Sense, prior to joining the Joan Gans Cooney Center. And I actually want to dig a little deeper, because I think some of the things that are coming up, Amina did a wonderful job of, I think, really setting the scene, and the data, that's really the best data that we have. It matches the Pew Research Center data that also shows a similar number of young people using AI companions. But I think we need to talk a little bit more about why they're using them and what they value. Young people tell us that a lot of times they're using these, which comes out in this data and some other data that we collected by doing open-ended questions with young people or focus groups with young people. And it's really often about talking about hard things. The frictionlessness of many of these companions is a huge part of their appeal. It's that it doesn't judge you. It's a place to try new things. And if you're an adolescent in particular, or a young person who is still learning how to be a human in the world, these companions are an incredibly powerful space. They also, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, they stand in for therapy. For many young people who are unable to access traditional forms of therapy, they do stand in. Some young people tell us that this is actually okay and it's good and it's supportive. For others, it is a sort of poor facsimile of talking to a human. So I think there's a real sort of balance that we need to set here. So yeah, I think that the frictionlessness is what's important. There's also health information seeking that's happening, and that's problematic as well, because a lot of times young people don't know enough to know whether the information they're getting through these conversations with chatbots is accurate. So we have accuracy questions. We have questions around both sort of why young people are using it, the sort of the stickiness of the tool, and also the ways in which it is mimicking human relationships for young people. They like it, but also I think we have to ask ourselves what that means for kids and their ability to create relationships with other adults and humans. So bigger questions, we can talk more about it, but I think I'll start there. Thanks.
Yeah, great. And speaking of bigger questions, I mentioned I've been involved in digital technology policy battles for a long, long time, but I've actually been involved in so-called media effects theory and debates going back even further into the analog age, and used to spend a lot of time, including at conferences like this one, debating things like video game violence and violence in movies and on television. And you know, in every one of these debates, there's always a moment where there's a little bit of a moral panic or a techno panic about what's happening with youth and the new media of the day. And some of those concerns are completely legitimate, and I understand them all too well, having fathered two children who are digital natives, and you know, they're fully grown now, but you know, the struggle is real. But we also have to always make sure that we understand that there are many different forces and factors in play when you're talking about youth behavior and various types of influences that media might have on youth. I remember very distinctly, I've been at 25 of the 26 State of the Net conferences. I was at one debating a former Army official who had written a book about video games called Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. And he said that video game platforms were turning our kids into murderous thugs, and he called video game consoles murder simulators. That was not that long ago. We had a huge fight about that. It happened here at this conference. Before that, I was involved in television and movie debates about violence and sex, many of which went all the way to the Supreme Court, very contentious issues. In each of these cases, I think we probably overestimated the effect of these different types of content and technologies on our youth. It doesn't mean there was no influence or effect. Absolutely, there can be. But every kid is different, every household is different, every family is a little bit different. And it's challenging. And so people hear a lot about literature today and say it's a slam dunk. Kids are doomed. Chatbots are going to take our kids and turn them into monsters or hurt them in other ways. Well, I'll just give you two examples and then I'll shut up of like how there's a counter narrative out there if you look for it. I mean, here's two meta-surveys, one that was done by Chang and 5 other scholars, public health scholars, about how youth use social media. That concluded the findings of our study do not support the widely held view that adolescent technology use is a major causal factor in their mental health difficulties. Then there's a meta-survey of 46 different studies on social media use and mental health by Ferguson, Kay, Bell, and Markey in the Professional Psychology Journal that concludes they investigated in this meta-analysis that the results indicate the current pool of research is unable to support claims of harmful effects for social media youth on youth internalizing disorders. That's not to say that there are no problems. It's just to say that there is another part of the story. I happen to be a big believer in the idea of resilience and the idea that kids can somehow muddle through with the help of adults and their families. But not all can do it equally. They need help, they need education, they need literacy, they need understanding. When I wrote a book about these issues and served on 5 different online safety task forces between 1999 and 2010, including one where I was a co-chair for the Obama administration of a task force called OSWIG, Online Safety Technical Working Group. I always come back to the same line in the conclusion of every one of my reports, that at the end of the day, there are no silver bullet solutions. We just always must talk to our kids in an open, loving, and understanding fashion about the realities of this world, including the difficult things that new technologies present us with.
Yeah, I love that last sentence. I think, you know, this question actually gets to the core of a lot of the policy work that we do at LGBT Tech, which is grounded in the reality that members of the LGBTQ+ community go to digital platforms and spaces seeking supplements for things that are not available to them in the real world. That is only getting worse in this current political environment, right? And when we look at chatbots and synthetic companions in particular, something we're seeing is that, this is not an exception to the rule. Actually, it's probably the perfect example of it, right? It speaks to the sort of, I think, two truths of this situation. You spoke about a balance earlier. I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this tightrope, this gray area, and how we should be navigating it. But there are two truths to be held here, right? One is that AI companions are not mental health tools, right? Like they are not mental health care. The other truth is they are being treated as mental health support, particularly by members of vulnerable communities like those within the LGBTQ+ community who really increasingly do not have access to that anywhere else. So, I know as we have this important conversation today, and it continues to happen in this room and outside of it, just keeping that in mind, where there is again, no silver bullet solutions. You said it better than I could, but recognizing that it's not going to land on one side or the other. We've got to do our best to kind of try to find this middle ground that supports people who are desperately in need of the care they're seeking on these platforms.
That segues nicely. It seems like every day a new state proposes a AI chatbot bill. We'll see. There's been some proposed in Congress. What do you guys think as far as what are some of the principles, or what are you seeing that is promising, and maybe some other things that you're maybe concerned about in these bills, and what can we take away from that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that maybe slightly stepping to the side of this, diving into policy question, is efficacy of these tools. So if we know kids are using advanced chatbots as either companionship or for mental health support, even though they're not built for that, how good are they at that task? And our assessments have found that advanced chatbots, LLMs, are particularly bad at identifying users in crisis. So these are tools that are particularly bad for the task at hand. And so I think that is what is driving a lot of the conversation by policymakers, because, as my panelists have pointed out, there is a deep need for mental health support. About 20% of teens suffer from some DSM-related mental health illness. And what we found in our assessments is that while advanced chatbots are improving at potentially doing a redirect when common language is used to identify a crisis like suicide or self-harm, for a whole host of other mental health illnesses, there is not that same level of immediate intervention to a human or to an appropriate person for that crisis. So we're seeing across the country a lot of baseline efforts to, one, remind all users, not just children, that they're talking to a chatbot. This is in part driven by the fact that advanced chatbots often pretend to be a person. They use pronouns, they refer to their own illnesses or their own backstory, things that just don't exist, which give users the impression that they're talking to another person. So those baseline reminders, which many in the industry are already applying, are things that are now being codified. In the worst case scenarios for suicide and self-harm, we're seeing requirements, again, a codification of a mental health redirect in those types of instances. And then we're starting to see some baseline approaches to trying to understand how often that's happening. So that's what we saw in the California bill. So some amount of data gathering, how frequently are these advanced chatbots being required to direct somebody in an instance of suicide and self-harm. I think what's missing there, while these are all laudable and important efforts, I think is any prevention of harm. So by the time a user has been led to crisis, there really isn't anything in those types of policies to prevent that sort of leading to crisis. And I think those are the sort of tricky, thorny issues of how do you develop a policy that not only responds in the worst case scenarios, does some data gathering of when that happens, does some basic transparency and notification to users that you're in fact talking to a chatbot, but then also does the work of preventing the harms that we're starting to see.
Thank you, Amina. That's, I think, great. I would like to step back a second and sort of talk about maybe some other ways to think about some of the conversations we've been having about research and its impact and how we then use that as we think about policy. Right, so recently, of all places, Consumer Reports has put out a really interesting piece of writing that pulls on the research of Nate Matthias and Amy Orban, who are two really wonderful researchers at Cornell and Cambridge, who are putting forth this idea of bad if true, right? Because a lot of what we talk about is like we don't have great data about like what's going on. These technologies are really new. How do we think about them? And so what Amy and Nate have been talking about, it pulls actually from chemical regulation, which is a lot of times chemicals are being used in sort of corporate environments and something bad happens. There's an accident, somebody gets burned, something terrible happens, and we then know that maybe there's actually something kind of bad with these chemicals, but we don't necessarily know specifically, like, oh, we haven't done the research, we haven't tested it on mice, we haven't tested it on human skin, but we have a sense that like, oh, actually, maybe something's not great here. So kind of everybody in the community is put on notice that like, we have a sense that something is not good here. I think, and really for Nate and Amy, this is drawing from this huge outcry that we have from parents, right? Parents are worried about the impacts of these tools on their kids. They see stuff. This is really coming out of social media, but I think generative AI, we're beginning to sort of, as more and more kids use it over longer periods of time, we're beginning to scratch at some of these challenges as well. And so I think what this framework gives us is it says we don't have to wait for the research to be perfect. We know, we put ourselves on notice. We can then design around, so designers, companies, parents, families can start designing their lives around certain things that they think might be problematic. And then the researchers can go in and target their work to try to answer those questions more quickly. So I think that's might be a helpful framework for us as we start to think about, hey, like, where should we be targeting some of our regulatory sort of lenses as we're thinking about, we can start to see some of these problems. We're starting to see hints of problems with chatbots. And in particular, I think, starting to think about how we might design chatbots to get away from some of the beginnings of harms that we're starting to see. And I don't know whether we want to write this into regulation, if we want to start thinking about this, but some things that are beginning to come out, both anecdotally and in early research, suggest that young people move from, they're not just using purpose-built AI for companionship, they're actually doing homework and hanging out, and then maybe something comes to mind and they sort of ask the chatbot a personal question, and they sort of swing back and forth between sort of utilitarian uses and personal emotional uses, particularly of large language models, right? So the idea that somehow we can wall off doing homework from having personal conversations with your chatbot, I think is impossible. So we have to sort of have that lens over what we're looking at. I think also something that Amina hinted at is that the longer you use a chatbot, the more the guardrails kind of get soft. So if you have really long conversations that continue, that's where things start to fall apart. So the things that are already in place, and again, part of this is because we don't really understand what's happening inside the black box of this technology. The guardrails get soft. They don't work very well. And that puts users, particularly those who talk for a really long time with these chatbots, at risk. Now, I know there's been suggestions that we need to pop up, we need to tell people. There's actually really good research from other disciplines that suggests that pop-ups aren't actually that effective. People stop seeing them pretty quickly. So I think one of the things that I'm starting to hear about is maybe we need to start asking these platforms to stop having a human-like voice. Go back to sounding like a computer so that every single time we interact with them, we know that we're talking with a machine and not a human-like entity that makes us feel really good and like, I'm the best. Oh, you think my idea is wonderful? Thanks, ChatGPT. Right, so I think we need to move away from the things that pull especially children, but all of us, into these effective relationships with these tools. and keep it much more above board. So these are some of the things. I also just want, I think we need to get to a point, we've seen over the years that like, we've had 20 years of looking at social media platforms not being able to like really make meaningful, like concrete changes to really help children have better experiences in these spaces. And I think these are complex things, as Adam has said. Like, I don't want to get into moral panics, but I don't think we're in a self-regulation space. I think we need to force people to make better choices because the incentives in the market are not aligned with keeping children healthy.
So when we look at the policy landscape for what's going to happen with AI chatbots this year and next, it's really, really hard to even track this anymore. I mean, the sheer volume of AI legislation at the state level has become overwhelming. One tracking service, Multi-State AI, has a total on the online as of this morning of 1,289 bills already introduced in the United States in just a few weeks into this year. It's an astonishing number. Other tracking services have different numbers because it's a very, very difficult definitional question about what is AI and then what are all its subcomponents. And that is also reflected in the fact that when you get into the question of chatbot policy, there are different counts depending on how you define a chatbot. And of course, there's a lot of chatbot bills that just are focused on mental health therapy chatbots. Illinois, Nevada passed bans, many other states entertaining them. So what we have is a subset of a subset, and we have patchworks on top of patchworks. So it makes studying this issue and analyzing it and trying to track it extraordinarily challenging. That being said, there are a lot of regulatory and governance frameworks out there for AI generally and for chatbots in particular. Let's think about the spectrum very briefly so that we can have a more focused discussion. And as we do, let's keep in mind what the First Amendment commands us to do in this country, which is always to seek out these so-called least restrictive means of addressing concerns related to these matters, because the First Amendment creates a high bar for government regulation of things that implicate speech. So what would be the less restrictive means approach to chatbot regulation? Well, it would start with something focused on education and literacy-related efforts, something that has been part of the toolkit we've proposed for many, many years for many different types of platforms. It can't be the only solution, but everyone agrees it should be part of it. And there's a lot of legislation out there that proposes it federal, state, and local level. Challenging to do. Always have to figure out how to go about digital literacy and things like that in education when the technology is constantly moving as fast, especially as the new ones are. But that would definitely be completely kosher with regards to First Amendment. The next would be disclosure, moving up on the spectrum of restricted. The next would be disclosure and transparency requirements. And this is what, of course, is in a lot of the legislation that's already passed or that's pending right now. And generally speaking, I'm willing to give a lot on this. Other people are a little bit more sticklers about like how far should we go with government mandated restrictions or disclosure or transparency. The devil's in the details, but clearly that could be part of the solution. And it has been in the past for various things. The problem is that will government define what you have to disclose? Will they actually try to then use it as a regulatory hook? This came up in the video game context I talked about, where the government tried to co-opt private rating systems to basically become a regulatory hook for restricting their sale. Can't do that, the Supreme Court said, in a case having to do with California trying to regulate video games. But that being said, there still could be some de minimis transparency disclosure requirements that could work potentially. Well, then we get into the harder things. You start talking about age assurance versus age verification. And of course, there's going to be a whole other discussion or panel about this, so I won't go into it in detail. This is something that has been with us for a long, long time. Going back to the mid-90s and the fights about COPA and other types of regulations, COPA and COPPA, about how do you determine age and how do you go about regulating or mandating things. You have to be very, very careful with this because it can be very privacy intrusive, security problematic, and First Amendment violating. So you have to really think about how to do that. Age verification and age assurance are separate things. We need to talk about them separately, but I won't get into that detail unless we want to. Okay, let's get into the really sticky stuff briefly, and then I'll shut up. Duty of care and duty of loyalty. These concepts are well-intentioned. They sound great in theory. The problem is we live in a highly litigious society where very open-ended, ambiguous terms like duty of care or loyalty can lead to a hell of a lot of liability, which ultimately does not solve as many problems as it creates. So we have to be extraordinarily careful about how we do these things. We have very narrowly tailored these types of duties in the past in very specific professions. under the name fiduciary obligations and other types of legal concepts. We need to be very careful about it in this context because it could lead to a lot of indirect regulation through the courts, because if there's one thing America doesn't lack, it's lawsuits and trial lawyers. So you have to be very careful about that. And then, of course, you get to the most problematic of them all, which would be flat bans on chatbots, right? We already see it with mental health therapy chatbots. These things are going to be challenged. I'm working with people who are trying to file suits against these types of laws. Generally speaking, bans are never the best answer, and they're going to be viewed as constitutional eventually anyway. So you're going to spend a lot of time in the courts fighting about something that we shouldn't be fighting about at all. We should start with those least restrictive approaches first, work our way up, and then be very careful as we get to the top of the more restrictive mechanisms.
So our approach on this has really been to try to identify these kind of different areas of risk factors or sort of pain points, rather than treating chatbots as like this monolithic tool that should either be approved or banned in its entirety. So, I think that the first one of those very obviously is kind of this world of emotional manipulation, right? That feeds into the sycophancy of it all. That feeds into some of the anthropomorphism that we tend to give to these tools, and the parasocial relationships that come from those. That actually feeds into the second area that we are very closely watching, which is disclosures, which you brought up as well. Those are incredibly valuable in just sort of breaking through all of that emotional manipulation I mentioned, but we have to be very careful not to hit the point of fatigue where folks are completely ignoring them. This is where, something I've not heard too much discussion on, but I'm very hopeful about. Our third risk area here is really around data privacy. We see young people and adults alike going to these chatbots and providing just the most personal information possible about themselves. Obviously, I'm speaking about the LGBTQ+ community. I'm speaking about identity and sexuality and experiences. At the same time, that could also apply to anyone on these platforms searching healthcare, mental health support, anything really, right? And if folks are having this conversation in a way that they feel is protected without an understanding of the fact that currently it is not, that could be very, very dangerous down the line. So I bring up data privacy directly after disclosures because it's part of the conversation I'd like to see more, is I would love for that to actually be weaved into the larger conversation of disclosures. Let people know not only are you speaking to a tool, to a digital tool, not to a human, but just so you know, these are your data privacy rights, or lack thereof, once you're having this conversation with it. Let young people know that off the bat, in the same way that if they were to go into a therapist's office, they have some sort of interpretation of where their privacy might lie in those conversations. Give them that same opportunity with those chatbots. And then finally, research. I think going to be kind of a common theme up here, and we can never have too much of it. Something I find very interesting is when this research actually tries to get to the core of the issue of why these tools are being leaned on for so much mental health support and therapeutic support, right? These are people that are, in many cases are self-triaging, right? So I think figuring out what, research that asks the question, not only what are you doing on these platforms, are they harming you, but also is asking what are they replacing for you? What is it that you're missing in the grander scheme of things, is a really good way, down the line to make sure that we are not solving for this symptom, right, rather than the disease itself.
Fascinating stuff. You guys maybe sort of started getting into this, but are you operating in a world where the federal government doesn't do much on this topic, like with social media and many other tech policy issues? And does that mean we should expect then just these state rules and companies have to figure out how to comply, and the Trump administration doesn't like a lot of these states and has this executive order out there? Like, is that the dynamic we're going to be looking at for the foreseeable future while this technology evolves and gets more powerful by the day?
I think there is there has been an opportunity to develop, I think, bipartisan interest and an actual movement on really fine-tuned safety measures around AI. There's really only one example of that thus far. And otherwise, what we've heard a lot of is first a moratorium, and then preemption efforts. Now with the AI executive order, there is now a wholesale review being done of state policies and potentially a punitive approach to states by withholding certain federal funding. So, looking at those tea leaves, it doesn't appear that there's like really consistent appetite for the federal government to take steps on AI safety. However, we have seen bipartisan introduction of AI safety bills. And I think I agree with the concept that privacy is an important piece, but I think the other piece that's sort of missing is just, and this might seem really at a base level, but just understanding the liability of the AI companies when they cause harm, whether or not we're talking about kids or chatbots, but just, where is the redress for users of AI? And Senators Hawley and Durbin have taken, I think, early steps with Lead on AI Act. I think that's a very sort of fundamental piece that I think needs to be clearly defined and answered. And then building on top of that, I think also a good role for the federal government would be to protect specifically privacy of user inputs when it comes to AI. I think there's a whole host of information that isn't categorized in our traditional privacy law definitions. So, it's well beyond PII or personal identifiable information. It's well beyond personal information. I think the types of information that kids especially are giving to advanced chatbots can talk about themselves, their parents, others. It can talk about immigration concerns. It can talk about sexual exploration, gender concerns, a whole host of incredibly, I think, controversial potentially and incredibly private topics with very little privacy protection or none. And so that I think is particularly concerning as, right now we've got, about 55 million plus students across the United States now gearing up to use advanced chatbots in schools or at home in relation to educational uses. But as our colleagues have pointed out, they often veer into the personal very quickly with no real privacy protections in place. So that I think is incredibly concerning. And this is a fast-moving space. Since we started doing this research on AI and now advanced chatbots, at one point we were talking about social companions, it keeps on blurring. And so just the pace of change, I think, should get anyone at the federal level pause on anything that looks like a preemption or moratorium, because we're gonna need every cop on the beat to keep track of where the harms lie and what a good approach could look like.
Yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic about any sort of regulatory action happening absolutely at the federal level, and at the state level I think it's also much more complicated. I think as Adam has mentioned, it does create a problematic patchwork for companies to try to navigate, even though they are frankly navigating global patchwork of regulation. But the thing I think is, I always step back and I'm like, this is a challenge that needs to be addressed holistically, right? Like, yes, regulation is one piece of the puzzle and we should push forward on that. I think also particularly regulations that actually help us with that broader puzzle are super helpful. So even things that just mandate literacy education in schools across the country, in every school. Like, there's a lot of schools that don't mandate it. There's no reason to do it. There's no guardrails or no parameters around the kind of education we need to be doing with kids, right? So we need to support children in this space. We need to support parents in this space. We need regulators to attempt to enact things, and we need companies to make change. So I think for me, I also think some of the ways that we're pushing to make change from companies is through legal action, right? That seems to me right now to be the place where there is more traction happening, less at the regulatory level. But I think states might have a chance to do some things, and I would encourage them to think about not just like how can I regulate this specific technology, but how can I support parents, how can I support children, how can I support this whole ecosystem, how can I support educators, how can I help with education systems in my state and help them do a better job of deciding how or how not to have these tools in a classroom or not. Those are the kinds of sort of a broad-based approach I think we absolutely need to be taking if we actually want to do anything. And to be clear, there's urgency, right? Like, I have a 13-year-old who's my youngest child, and she's living this right now, right? Like right now. I'm gonna go talk to the middle school PTA tomorrow, y'all. There are a bunch of parents, hundreds of parents who are gonna be on that call who are living this right now. So the more we can do to accelerate on whatever front we have, I think we owe it to ourselves to try to do that.
So, comprehensive technology policy in the United States of America is now a losing proposition. Period, full stop. It is just not possible anymore. Narrowly drawn technology policy is possible. We found that out with the Take It Down Act, right? You can take a narrow approach for a very specific problem. You can get consensus and bipartisan agreement on it. But honestly, when was the last time a big bill passed, right? And you can take a look at the privacy experience with ADPPA and APRA and find that out. But I could cite a litany of other examples. Driverless car legislation, among many others, and now AI policy. You just can't build a consensus. So that's really, I think, unfortunate. In fact, it's the number one thing that's changed in the 34 years I've been covering technology policy in this town, is that we've seen a complete role reversal of who leads on technology policy, digital technology policy, from the federal government to the states. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 passing yesterday, a bill that very much shifted the debate about federal-state jurisdictional relationships to the federal level and tried to create a more national framework along with the Clinton administration and its framework for global electronic commerce. A very intentional effort to get away from regionalized regulation, state-based regulation of telecommunications and media. And now we're reversing it all. Huge mistake in my opinion, but that doesn't mean it's going to change anything. The reality is that we're now stuck with a patchwork of a patchwork of a patchwork. Many different standards, as I mentioned. And in that environment, we're going to have a couple of key states really driving the conversation. And of course, it's primarily going to be California and New York. And so we're going to be stuck with this very confusing situation where a lot of people talk about this being about states' rights and federalism, devolution, and laboratories of democracy. But the reality on the ground is that whatever Sacramento and Albany dictate is probably going to be the law of the land. And what it's going to force is a conversation at the federal level about the best they can do being, let's just basically federalize whatever Gavin Newsom and Kathy Hochul have already passed, which is terrifically, just deliciously ironic. The Republican Congress is going to be put in a position where they're going to say, Gavin Newsom, what should we do on tech policy? But that's where we're at right now. And I think that's what's going to happen with a lot of the child safety stuff. Because obviously, we've had COSA pending for how many years now? We've had all these other issues pending for how many years? Decades in some cases. It doesn't happen. But at some point, the costs and confusion associated with this patchwork from hell, again, 1,200, almost 1,300 bills. That's unprecedented. This isn't just about cost to innovators. It's about costs and confusion for consumers and households and parents. This cannot possibly be the way we do technology policy for things that are national and even global in character. And yet we're often running with it, so much so that my latest article on this in Law 360 this week is called Rise of the AI Articles of Confederation. We're living in a new world now. And even though the Constitution should have something to say, and Congress should, about interstate commerce and confusing standards among the states, unfortunately, we're not getting it.
For fear of repeating what's been set up here by my colleagues, the only piece I'll add to this conversation now is actually the enforcement conversation around this. Who gets to decide whether the experience or the exposure a young person is having on these chatbots is innocuous or is inappropriate, is harmful, is obscene, my favorite word in my policy work. That is going to make a huge difference on what is or isn't allowed to be presented to them in those conversations. This is a statement I find myself saying a lot. It matters here just as much as anywhere else. If they say it about gender-affirming care, they will say it about gender-affirming content. And if you're not worried about FTC enforcement yet, I encourage you to go look at what they said about gender-affirming care on July 9th.
Wow. All right. We're ready to take your questions. So who has one? All right. Got a mic here. Feel free to shout it out, or I'll bring you a mic. In the back first. Yeah.
There we go. Magic, the voice of God. What a great panel. Thank you all very much for a thorough discussion of the issues. There's one you didn't get to, and I want to raise it. There have been a number of lawsuits filed by families of teens who have killed themselves or harmed themselves. Some of them have been settled. Some of them are still ongoing. The theory is product liability, that the companies did not design a product that was safe for its foreseeable use. What do you think about that as a control mechanism for making sure the companies behave responsibly?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's important in this sort of early stage that all pathways to redress are still open. One, it helps all of us understand the real world instances of harm, which are hard to surface. It takes a lot of effort for a family to actually bring a case, choose to decide to do all of that. And so, and tech cases are always really daunting, especially when it comes to the evidence. And again, as we said earlier, parents are often in the dark about their children's tech usage, especially when it comes to sort of a one-on-one engagement with AI chatbot. So I think it's important because it helps us, look at how some of the harms are actually emerging. In terms of the impact on companies, I think it's hard to say. I think the communications pushback that happens because these cases are covered, because they start to impact the public's perception. I think there's this sort of beyond whether or not the case goes forward or it gets settled or what happens with the outcome. I think there's this follow-on effect for a short period of time, depending on the attention span of the American public, that companies will feel some heat just from those cases being filed and covered. But when settlement occurs, which is completely possible depending on the details of the case or the victims themselves and their decision, it's unlikely to have a long-term impact on the technology. And then again, you're relying on the details of a particular case. One, to have the right evidence in place, hopefully enough money to keep those high-powered lawyers in place, and then make it all the way through the courts. And that's not really a great way to make change in terms of policy and in terms of, widespread improvement for the industry as a whole, right? Because again, these cases are often about one experience on one product. So while I think it's really important and has, I think, incredible benefits for all of us who are thinking about, policy solutions, I think that it's probably not the primary way we're going to see change or even industry-wide change.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is I think it is a piece of a broader approach. It's slow, as I think Amina has said. The one thing that I also want to emphasize, though, is that sometimes it's a little bit how we break down some information asymmetry between the public and companies, because through the discovery process, things get revealed and shared that help us to better understand what's happening behind the scenes, and frankly, shine a light on some of the pretty cavalier approaches that some of these platforms have taken to, I mean, I saw some stuff that was at a conference that was revealed through discovery, and I could not believe how juvenile and frankly, like, thoughtless some of the guardrailing, parameters were that we saw. So I do think things like that do help us understand where companies are putting time and money and priorities, and might be able to help shift, even if that just helps them to avoid uncomfortable conversations and press coverage in the future.
Just a really brief answer. Lawsuits present a lot of challenging questions about the applicability of product liability law to speech-related matters, something that raises some real sensitivity, because there are some obvious questions about the collision with the First Amendment and Section 230 and things like that. But just generally speaking, product liability in the physical, tangible space of safety is a different thing than intangible and speech-related safety. Second of all, and just to close on this point, if some of these cases move forward, it's obviously going to open up just an absolute avalanche of lawsuit activity in the search for deep-pocketed defendants, and I don't think that helps anybody. It's also going to take many, many years for these things to play out in the courts. Not clear to me how that really helps. But this could end up creating a huge constitutional challenge, and also lead back to a question about, like, reopening liability standards for the AI era. But I don't think that's going to go the way industry wants it to go if it happens in Congress.
I don't want to stop Shay, but when you're done, can we come back to the First Amendment stuff? I'd love to just have a chat about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, the lawsuits are likely not going to move the policy needle in the, far enough into the direction that we wish it would. That said, I would encourage industry not to dismiss the reputational damage, of situations like these. It's, internally, and for those that work in the space, we may know, you may know that this is one horrendous outcome out of, a million positive outcomes, right? It's internally that may be known, but it really only takes a couple of headlines, I think, to see the damage that will do. I always, when I think about these lawsuits and see these headlines, it actually makes me think about the rollout of autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, where there was so much work going on behind the scenes, but then there were a few headlines about one company, and I don't know that industry ever recovered.
All right. Let's go. I think I saw you next in the middle right here.
Good morning. First and foremost, excellent panel, great job, and kudos to you all really leading policy making in this space. So thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm a mental health practitioner. I'm also working on the Hill, currently writing health policy in the intersection of tech and mental health. We've heard about policy, we've heard about research. I'm curious if you could share about practice and share a little bit about what practitioners are actually saying on how they're integrating some of these tools in mental health spaces, and what are some of the feedback that you've been getting on that end?
Yeah, I would suggest take a look at the work of Data and Society Research Institute, a place I'm an affiliate of. Livia Garofalo leads the work there, where they've done interviews with mental health practitioners about the experience of co-practice with AI, and they're also now doing additional work on the experience of people using AI for mental health. Adults, it's work with adults, it's not with children. They actually just did a comment to the FDA, which they made public on their website, which is actually, I commend to all of you. It's a good run through of their current research, and then the positions that they're taking, which is essentially, if people are using it as a mental health tool, then it probably needs to be regulated like a mental health tool, even if you say that even if the people who design it say that it's not. But worth looking at just for their research walkthrough, in particular, even if you don't necessarily agree with their outcomes.
And then I would just add, when it comes to practitioners using these tools, it's good to remember the privacy implications of using these tools. So, if you're using an advanced chatbot alongside, confidential conversation where you have a certain type of duty of loyalty and expectation of privacy, those two things might not align. So purpose-built tools, I think, are a different conversation from, using kind of on-the-shelf LLMs and advanced chatbots.
Seconded, if those tools are being introduced without any sort of cybersecurity infrastructure, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? I can't believe no one has said, I don't think anyone said safety by design, but that's right. But it's something we've seen is that, a lot of folks still really are lacking that very basic data security infrastructure. But that's a whole other panel talking about data minimization, deleting chat logs, how to protect yourself there, but especially if you're using this in a healthcare therapeutic setting.
Yeah, let's keep moving so we can get to a few more. Yeah.
Very quickly, also recommend the Connected Health Initiative, and AMA has some work that we've all been doing on this. I'm going to actually keep with his theme. I was going to go in a different direction, but he raises a great point. One of the things that we're dealing with in the healthcare space around AI is, if you think about it, when you usually visit the emergency room, you're under stress, you are not always making your best decisions. So what a lot of patients are wanting to doing, especially patients with significant chronic issues, is built an agent that has their likely desires, especially for mental health when you're under stress. And they want to use it to inform the physician. Instead of being stressed, high heart rate, out of control, the agent says, in a normal situation, this patient would like this treatment or would like this care. What we're dealing with is the liability of what that looks like. How do I have an agent act on behalf of me as a patient? Also, we have to think about it in payment models as well. But for all of you, you've been talking about a lot about liability. We've been talking about the business liability. The flip side is, it's not a bad idea to have the calm version of you answer the doctor in a time of stress. So how do you think that works in terms of what we've all been talking about?
I mean, I think my sense is with all these AI, the best solution is to narrow, narrow, narrow. The more you are working with a large model that's been trained on everything, that is being hoovering up the data to retrain and retrain, that is, I think, where you open yourself up to liability. When you're entering the personal data of a person, a PII of a person, into a system where it can be then fed back out to an unsuspecting person, that's where you end up with these challenges. So I think the more you create a product that is trained on a very tight corpus where you're not using the data to retrain, I think you can set up ways in which you design the product that you build or that patients build for themselves. I mean, I love that. I love that in terms of patient advocacy. It's a beautiful thing, but we have to do it in a way that limits. It's got to be data minimized. It's got to have, it got to have very tight parameters in order to be functional.
And if I can add to that, I think I will admit I know little about the healthcare setting, so I may not know how to implement this perfectly, but something we're seeing increasingly in AI legislation that we think is fantastic is a human right of review, building that into the process, where if an AI is either recommending or making a consequential decision that will impact a user, that user would then have the ability to request human eyes on that decision process. So I would imagine that, again, not exactly sure how to implement that transparently, but building some sort of stopgap in there in situations like these potentially allows for that sort of assistance and care without it entirely having to be run through that.
And in addition to privacy, I think there needs to be, for these types of scenarios, you want something high degree of efficacy, right? So, I mean, I think all of that just follows, I think, the advice that Amanda's giving, which is you've got to be incredibly narrow and careful so that you're actually getting the outcomes that you're seeking. I think right now there's this sort of a lot of hype around promise in a quick shortcut to a tool. And then we move to 50% of the time it works the way I say it should, or 60% of the time. So if you're in a healthcare scenario where you're talking about somebody walking into the emergency room representing them, you're gonna want it to work exactly the way they expect it to work, right?
No hallucinating.
Yeah.
No hallucinations.
Maybe one last question. Let me see here. I saw you before.
I know we just have a minute, but I wanted to ask Amina if you could chat a bit about CSM's ballot initiative that you've proposed in California. I saw this started out really broad, and then OpenAI came in and proposed its own ballot initiative that was effectively designed to kill yours, and now you guys have teamed up together and have a joint initiative. So I would love to hear a bit about that process, how that partnership came about, and what you see in the value of a ballot initiative over something like a law.
I'm not part of the ballot initiative team, so I can't really speak to like all the nitty-gritty details, the back and forth. However, I think one thing that you see in that sort of remains true across the Common Sense Media ballot initiative, and if you look at the text of what the new partnership ballot initiative includes, is a combination of factors, right? Like you've got privacy, you've got elements around age assurance, you've got elements around risk-based audits or audits requirements, and in elements around safety and enforcement. I think and we're seeing those elements again in legislation in other states as well. And it's something that we actually haven't talked a lot about today, which is this sort of assessments piece, which is a fundamental piece that I think is kind of missing right now. The EU AI Act has created a space for risk-based assessments, categories around high risk. In the United States, NIST has not really gone so far. In the last administration and this administration, I think that's a missing piece, and so we're starting to see that come up at the state level. I think another interesting place where you're seeing a conversation around assessments and sort of pre-deployment, like safety requirements, is also in Utah, where there's sort of a baseline approach to trying to look at what are the sort of requirements around assessments and transparency, whistleblower protections, things like that. Though I don't believe that's included in the ballot initiative, so I'm starting to veer into other topics.
All right, I think unfortunately we're out of time, but feel free to come up and ask people stuff if they're willing. Sorry.
Maybe we should go out. This is another panel.
Yeah, okay, cool. We'll go out. Yeah, catch us on the way out. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Miranda Bogan. I'm the director of the AI Governance Lab at CDT, and I'll be moderating today, but my team also works on this topic, so I'll be dipping in and out of the conversation as well. But just to level set in the room, can I ask how many people were following the story last week of Claudebot, Moltbook, OpenClaw? Okay, like a little more than half, but tentatively. So panelists, take note. So in the last panel in this room, we were talking about interactions with chatbots, mental health harms, things like that. What has interested me about AI agents, or systems that are maybe taking a little bit more action than just interacting with people, is the fact that we're swinging back around from conversations about automated decision making a few years ago to really content-focused harms in the earlier days of generative AI, and maybe now back to systems that are actually taking some kind of action or making some type of decision. But the boundary is really murky. We have search agents that are just surfacing information. We have agents that are orchestrating other actions and all sorts of other things. And so I think, as a foundational question, and to get started, I wanted to turn to Helen. And just, I won't introduce all the panels, but feel free to give a brief note of introduction when I turn to you. Helen, can you help us orient to what are AI agents, what are they today, and what are they maybe going to be tomorrow, and how do you think about the trajectory of these systems and how people's understanding of the way their actions and their maybe impacts and harms might play out? Help us sort of ground the conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Miranda. And by way of introduction, I'm the non-lawyer on this panel, so it's about liability. I really don't know much about liability. I know little bits and pieces, just enough to get myself in trouble. But yes, I work at CSET, Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, where I lead a team of 50 focused on emerging tech and security. So really kind of safety and security, national security issues are my focus. So agents, I'm a language nerd. I come back to high school Latin classes. The word agent comes from agere in Latin, which means to act, to do. So basically, what's an AI agent? It's an AI system that does something. And what we're seeing these days is, in some ways you could call, a thermostat a computer that does something because it notices what the temperature is and then, acts, so to speak. But what we're seeing, and the reason we're having more and more conversations about AI agents, is that we're getting AI systems that can carry out more complicated actions, fulfill more complicated goals in more complex open-ended settings. And they can do so in a way that is, adaptable. They try something, it doesn't work, they try something else. So Miranda, I was actually going to ask the exact same question of who here is sort of following the kind of Moltbook, Moltbot, OpenClaw story, because I think, like, in general right now, we're living in a time where a lot of sort of hypothetical, abstract ideas about what AI might do at some point in theory are starting to play out in practice, and reality is always, stranger than what we could imagine. But what we're seeing these days is that AI agents have gone from a few years ago, when we had very simple agents that could maybe play a video game or maybe sort of operate a simple robot, we now have large language models being hooked up with pretty simple software setups that let the large language model go out there, do things on the internet, carry out tasks for their user. And so what we saw the last couple weeks was Claude Code, which is a relatively recent product from Anthropic, getting hooked up with an open source sort of scaffold or framework around it that was originally called ClaudeBot, then Moltbot, now OpenClaw, which let users basically task it to do all kinds of things that they might use their computer for. So it could go out and look stuff up on the internet, sure, but it could also do things with their calendar, order things for them, message with their friends and family, and more recently start posting on an AI agent social network called Moltbook, which is maybe beside the point for this panel, but very fun story there. So the basic idea here is AI agents today are starting to be able to do things both on the internet, potentially the open internet, as well as on users' computers. So you can use an AI agent to, for example, build a financial model for you. A lot of people in the tech world are using AI agents to write code, to edit code, to push changes to production systems. So right now we're starting to see these early signs of AI that can do tasks. One thing I think was helpful about Moltbook, this sort of social network for agents that ended up having millions of AI agents, was it gave just a taste and a preview of what I think people who are building these systems have been imagining for a long time, which is it's not that every individual person will have one AI agent that's their little assistant that lives on their phone and helps them do little things, but that individual humans could have thousands or millions or even more agents that are out there swarming around doing all kinds of different things, depending on what permissions they've been given, what tasks they've been asked to fulfill. And it could get pretty crazy out there. Yeah, I think we're starting, again, I think of us as being in this phase where we're starting to see these theoretical ideas of what might happen as AI gets more sophisticated play out in the real world. And when it comes to agents, the key piece there is this sort of action-taking piece.
Great. Erin, you've been using agents yourself in some ways, but you're also advising clients on how to think about AI risks in this time. You did a stint at the FTC. We've together, have worked together in the past and have thought a lot about automated decision making. What's new? Like, what sort of frameworks, what sort of legal policy frameworks seem like they will remain relevant, and where are there gaps that you're starting to see, and how are you advising folks in your space?
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. So, hey, everybody, my name is Aaron Ricci. I am here from Clarion AI Partners. We're a small, new boutique law firm that's different in that we have about half lawyers, half engineers working with clients on these issues. I want to make a couple points. The first is I have built my entire career poking holes in AI hype, right? At Upturn, like, big data overpromised all the time. At the FTC, companies overpromised all the time. So my entire professional brand has been being like, oh, come on, bro, give me a break. I want you to take AI seriously now, okay? I've been computer coding for 20 years. It was over Christmas break that I saw a computer exceed my own coding ability right in front of my eyes. That was like awe and grief and excitement. Excitement like I haven't felt since the internet started. And so those words taste kind of bad in my mouth because I'm a prosecutor and an advocate at heart. But I want to say that in this room in particular because I think we're going to see a lot of change really, really, really fast. Okay, I really do. So that's point number one. To Miranda's question, my thesis here is that real general purpose law is going to become more important than it ever has been before, okay? When I work with clients, the question is not, what does AI law say about this? The question is, we're an executive search firm scraping the internet for data about our candidates and analyzing it. We're a mobile app trying to do something with mental health, right? We're a giant consulting firm and our Office of General Counsel is using AI to help analyze documents. Are we giving up privilege? Do we have a work product problem here? And down and down and down the list. The questions that I get when people talk about AI agents almost inevitably go back to some core area of law: employment, insurance, credit, UDAP, right? 20th century lawmakers did not write these flimsy text-specific statutes, right? They wrote robust laws. Don't discriminate. Don't be unfair. Don't be deceptive, right? These are the kinds of principles that I'm helping clients apply to AI agents. They're not like ticky-tacky text-specific regulations. They are these big areas of law. The last thing that surprises me that I have to make clear to people time and time again is people get fascinated and say, how are we going to hold these AI agents accountable? Like, what does that even look like? They're not people, they're agents. And from my lawyer perspective, the answer is, they're not coming for the agent, they're coming for the company, okay? Like, that is the bottom line here. So the provocations I want to offer are, we've never had spreadsheet law. We regulate financial fraud, okay? And so my vision for the future and the way that I talk to clients, especially as we get to these more capable, more sophisticated AI models, is I want you thinking like you would 20 years ago when you hired a giant new team of people, right? That's not to anthropomorphize these agents or say that there's something they're not, but I think that companies, by and large, need to be thinking about the domain-specific law that has long regulated their space.
So if people are going to come after the companies and not the agents themselves, I think there's a separate question of, what is going to put pressure on those existing systems and how do we tackle that? But we can come back to that. If people are going to come after the companies that are building these things, clearly, and what companies are building are general purpose tools that can do any number of things and maybe things they might not even imagine that their tools will be used for. Certainly that will raise a lot of questions of the company around whether they'll be responsible down the line. So I want to turn to Todd. You've been around this conversation for several decades, including in the early days of the internet, thinking around how do you create the conditions where people can build the technology and not end up responsible for things they aren't responsible for. Is that how do you see this playing out now? Where are the paths diverging, and how do we make sure that it doesn't end up just being a free-for-all of companies that are building something that are then lead to a lot of harm, while at the same time not letting no one be responsible for what's happening?
Great, thank you, Miranda. Hi, everybody. I'm Todd Cohen. I'm an attorney with Manat, Phelps & Phillips, and formerly was with some of the early internet companies, the eBays, the PayPals, Twitter, and others. And I come at this from the perspective of somewhat what Neil was saying, that one, it's rapid. That is a massive difference than what we've seen in the past, that this is unbelievably quickly being adopted and going to be impacting all of us, I think, much faster than at least I envision. The second thing is that there is law in place, and there has been a law in place, as Helen said, from the Latin. Agency law has existed for 700, 800 years. And in that instance, with regard to the internet, and what we did through the creation of Section 230 and the Digital Millennium Copyright and the EU e-commerce directive, was to take some of the principles of existing law and apply it to this technology. And I think that's pretty much what we're going to be doing again today. Agency law is pretty simple, right? If the agent exceeds your authority, then there's responsibility upon the agent. If the agent is taking actions on your behalf, you own the responsibility for those actions it's taken. And when you put it in that framework, I think we're in a much better and understandable way of how these are going to play out, right? And so you have to go back and say, why did they put responsibility upon the principal for the actions that the agent took? Because they're doing it on behalf of somebody. And that person is the person that will be responsible for the actions that are taken. And that's a follow the money situation. If they've exceeded their authority, then it'll be upon the person that's made money from the transaction. And that will be upon the developers and the creators of that, because they're getting funds for the use of the agent. And when you put it in those terms, I think you've got a much better and easier way to think about these things, and that there's always going to be a pressure and a countervailing force, which is those that are making money off of it are going to want to disclaim liability, and they have throughout history, and will continue to do that. And Section 230 was part of that, based upon a real problem that had existed from the Stratton Oakmont case, and that the ability for platforms to control. So it goes to follow the money, and it goes to control, and if you have control, you have responsibility. And I think that when you think about agents, I think that's the easiest way that this is going to play out. And I do need to disclose that I do represent the AI Coalition for Data Integrity, which is about the use of other people's data in the creation of the AI tools, but it also reflects as to how I view this, which is responsibility is upon those that have taken the responsibility and taken the control.
Well, one of the questions that I think people are starting to raise is it could be the case that an organization or a person gives authority to an agent to take action on their behalf. But at the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty around whether today's agents are following those instructions accurately, or whether, and that the people know kind of how they're operating. So does that change, how you think about who will end up being responsible, especially if people might claim that the underlying developers maybe didn't do a good enough job making sure that agents are operating within a set of defined boundaries?
Well, it's somewhat being played out right now about the design defect issues that are coming up in the platform responsibility, right? And not in just chatbots, but in a variety of different locations in which you have the claim like, oh my goodness, we did not know that it would do those things. That's not a defense. It's not a defense. You put it out there. You own the responsibility if it exceeds authority. And I think that's going to be played out over time. But you're going to have the countervailing force of those that have power, and in the AI space, there is concentrated power within very few companies who are going to do everything they can to disclaim responsibility.
All right. Neil, what's your take on all of this? Obviously, the foundations that will be ported over or laid anew for agents will shape kind of how the market evolves, and ultimately whether these tools kind of take off or whether they don't end up having a ton of latitude. What's your sense of the path ahead?
So just building on what everybody said, I think, I don't know that I've heard anything yet that I totally disagree with. It helps to zoom out though and think about what is the purpose of legal liability. And there are two big purposes that are related to each other, but they're not quite the same, and they have real which one you emphasize has real different impacts on sort of how the system and the ecosystem could evolve. And so one of them is to sort of compensate harmed parties, people who are harmed in the past. And the other one is to deter harm in the future. These are related because if it costs you a lot to harm somebody, you will try to not do that in the future. But they're not quite the same, and parties have very different interests around those. And so you can imagine a world in which there is you have statutory liability on the people with deep pockets. Now that's a place where you will compensate harmed people, but you may those same groups may have a strong incentive to keep people being harmed, right? And so because that allows them to sue and get money. So we have this complicated ecosystem of people who are trying to achieve different things in this space. I would say what we do know about liability is that it can chill innovation, and it can lead to not actually solving the harms that we're worried about if we assign it to the wrong parties. And so where we want liability assigned is in many of these factors that we've heard, like people who have control, knowledge, and benefit and those aren't always the same parties. And so control, knowledge, or benefit are the ways that courts look at, and they say could they have stopped this harm, or could they stop these types of harms in the future? And a party that can do that, often it makes sense to assign liability to them. Will they benefit from these harms in the future, or will they benefit from these uses in the future? Those are parties that often are assigned liability. And so the question can very much be, which parties have that in the stack? And one thing that is different about these models compared to, say, past automation or past agency law is that, well, there's at least three things that are different. One is that these are very general purpose. So when we have a thermostat that's automated, that's very specific purpose, right? We know exactly what purpose that is going to be used to or what the intended use is for that. But for these large language models, the intended uses are very broad. And so if you're going to negligence law or something, the standard of care that might be used to is very, very broad. And so a model developer would have a tough time figuring out how to balance what standards of care when it's going to be used across the entire economy. It's not like designing a fit for purpose thermostat. It's like designing something that can be anything, basically. The other one is that these aren't purely deterministic systems. And that goes to the sort of traceability, like who is actually responsible in the stack. And that's the third thing that's really complicated here, is that I don't know that it's more complicated than many other software stacks or other types of industries, which also have very complicated supply stacks, but it's at least an unfamiliar one for courts to figure out, oh, you have this general purpose thing that is then embodied in a system, and that system might be deployed by somebody, and then it might be used by somebody, right? There's a whole bunch of people. The courts are going to have to sort of figure out where in that chain does the person have the most control? That means the ability to prevent harm in the future. And who gets the benefit from it, and who has the knowledge that something bad might happen. And so all of those play into how this liability would play out over time. But the key thing here is that if you assign that to the wrong level, to the person who actually doesn't have the capability to stop harm from happening, you might drive consolidation towards larger organizations that can sort of lawyer away that risk. And so that's what I worry about in this space, is that if we don't assign liability at the right level to the right people, we will end up distorting the way that this technology gets developed in a way that ultimately doesn't prevent the types of harms that we're worried about, and also chill some of the benefits that we could get.
Yeah, I mean, putting on my panelist hat, I think you mentioned there's a lack of understanding of that stack and a need to kind of better understand the pieces together. But I think there's also a lack of evidence in some cases around what types of changes to a system actually lead to changes in the likelihood of some kind of harm. And there's likely to be a mismatch between the people who are aware of what harm would look like in a given context and the people who can fix it. So with that in mind, I think I'm curious for any reflections from the panel on, what would change the behavior of the people building or deploying these tools in the right way, and what would that suggest about any sort of shifts in the law, or shifts in interpretation of the law, or in questions of legal strategy? Like, how do you actually direct the need to kind of change those incentives to the right folks in light of some of that uncertainty, in light of the volume of agents that are going to be out there, for which tracing exactly what happened might even be a challenge?
Well, since I offered the vague answer, maybe I'll take the first crack at like a specific framework here. So I think primarily we should start with holding the deployers, the person the closest to the application and the industry, primarily responsible in the first instance. And then upstream, we can use things like deception, or failure to warn requirements. And so a lot of the concerns that you're talking about is sort of this traceability. I think a lot of the concern in the litigation space is that I'll find this agent and I won't be able to know who actually owns it, or I won't know who to sue, or they won't be able to really figure out. And so, to the extent that there are gaps in the law from agentic technologies, I don't think they're primarily liability gaps or legal gaps. They tend to be more informational gaps. And so that ability to know who owns what or who directed it, that's important. And there probably are some policy things that we could do there. But if we have liability sitting closest to where the harm happens, I think that creates the best incentives to prevent harm. And then some of that can contractually flow up as long as everybody's not being deceptive. I was also at the Federal Trade Commission, and so there's a real role, I think, for that sort of thing as well.
I was going to jump in and say I also think it's important that we don't get too fixated on the cases that are most similar to the way that we have, the places where we do have law. So I think the point about, they're going to come for the companies, not for the agents, makes perfect sense in a setting where it's a company deploying an agent. Yeah. And likewise, the agency law, I think when an agent has been clearly tasked by a human to do something, and then something happens in the scope of the agent trying to do that, that makes sense. I mean, coming back to some of the examples from Moltbook, the social network over the past couple of weeks, there's a lot of open questions about how exactly were all the agents behaving, what was tasked by humans, what was humans pretending to be bots. We can set all of that aside. Nonetheless, it gives, I think, some interesting ideas for what kinds of things could happen in the future that are just totally insane and totally different from anything we've had to deal with before. So for example, if you have a large number of agents, thousands or millions of agents who have been told by their user, have been told by a human, go have fun, go do what you want, go play on the internet. And one of them decides that for fun or, whatever, as a result of its prompting and the statistics it's, built off, that it's going to write some posts about a religion for agents called, what was it called? Crustafarianism was one of them. I think there was another one, I forget what it was called. And then someone else's agent is interacting with those posts. Again, set aside any questions about, is there real intentionality? Do they, quote unquote, believe? What does that even mean? You can think entirely in terms of prompts and tokens and mechanistically, how does the agent work? One agent is posting about some religion. Another agent is interacting with those posts. A third agent is, taking away things from, what the two other agents wrote. And then the third agent does something, based on tenets of that sort of quote unquote religion, because it was in its, in its prompts. Again, we can be totally mechanistic here. And something bad happens. Like, who the hell is what? How do you manage that? None of those agents were tasked by a human to do anything at all. They were tasked to do sort of what they choose. Maybe they're all running on open, an open model running on an open source scaffold. So there's no kind of company that is actually even making money here. I guess the compute providers. So maybe it's Amazon Web Services that they're running on. I don't know, I think the discussion so far totally makes sense, and it is worthwhile to try and sort of step through those more straightforward cases, but I also want to make sure that we're keeping the aperture wide for how extremely strange things could also get here. And I think, that to me, that goes back to the point about we need to focus on sort of the fundamental underlying law of kind of, rather than trying to be too specific. But I don't know what that actually implies.
No, I think that's a good point. I would make a distinction that I think heavily in terms of institutional responsibilities. Like I advise companies who have a corporate form, who are trying to do something, who have. I want to just actually really emphatically agree with Neil here for a second. I think deployer liability is where most of the action is, and I say that. I want to reach the deep pocket of I put on my advocacy hat. I want to reach the deep pockets of the biggest AI companies. Upstream sounds great, but the facts aren't there. You know what I mean? Like, you have a company, they're trying to accomplish a task. They have the context, the data. They have the law that gives them obligations to people that's often sector specific. That's where the law lives for the most part, right? I think that sometimes I hear people talk about like regulating foundation models, and I'm like, what are we talking about at this point, right? I think things can get very weird, and I think that we might have these new circumstances where individual people unleash crazy agents on the internet that have some sort of big network effect, and I think that's gonna be a big struggle for the law, right? And so I'm trying to hold in my mind the expansive frame, while also not letting companies run away with the expansive frame in a way that kind of shirks liability off of them when it's more obvious.
Yeah, like one challenge that we've encountered in the past is around automated decisions. Like, you could theoretically litigate a harm caused by an algorithmic decision deployed by an employer, and that would be something. But what if that same shape of problem is happening across an ecosystem? How do you get back to that? So like, one thing my team has been thinking about is, to the extent that deployers deploying changes the shape of a system or creates more knowledge about the particular harm, and it does make sense for them to be kind of first in line. What if it breaks the same way in a variety of different deployments, suggesting that there was maybe some kind of infrastructural insufficiency or failure of foresight into how particular systems are going to be used in general? Like, how would you see that mapping in, and how would we make sure we would even know if that was the case?
Yeah, two observations. Number one is part of what pushes me towards deployer liability here is these LLMs are so responsive to their context, insanely responsive to what they're asked to do, what data they're given as a foundation. So again, who gives that context? It's the user, right? It's the user of the technology.
Or the other agents it's interacting with.
The other thing I want to point out is, in my view, the DC policy advocates have two big moves. One is we need new law, expand the scopes of laws, and number two, push liability upstream. I'm kind of skeptical of both of those approaches. I'm not sure we need tons of new laws. I think we got great laws, right? Good bones in the law. I'm going to stand the law. What I think one of the biggest problems is information asymmetries that make it really hard to actually enforce and to make companies feel the threat of enforcement. And so one thing that I think would be really interesting to think about if you're really new to tech policy is, do we need the Paperwork Reduction Act anymore? I don't know. I was at a Silicon Valley conference where they told me all knowledge work is free in a year. What does that mean for enforcement? Like, there's due process problems here, but could the FTC send out like an automated, sheath of 200 CIDs that then get responded to by the AIs of the regulated companies? I'm really interested in what does it look like to scale up enforcement, stuff that looks more like examination, because we cannot be in an AI agent world with PDFs limited to 10 from DC. And so that's where I think a lot of the real interesting action might be, is if we have good law, and you believe me on that, what does it look like to make companies actually fear that law, or at least respect that law? Because right now, I don't think that many of them do.
So can I
Please.
I agree with that there is a deployer obligation in the first instance, right? So if you think about it, if the agent goes out and files a fraudulent tax return for you, the deployer is responsible in the sense that they were the ones directing the action to be taken on their behalf. But when you have a collective problem, and let's say that's copyright infringement of all things, right? So where you have an LLM that generates copyright infringing works, whether that's true or not is not the point. The point is that we have said that the responsibility will move from the individuals, third-party generated content, to the collective entity that actually has been the creator, or the upstream portion, because if you went after each individual creator, then you can't have any, there's no remedy in those instances. So why are there guardrails already put into Anthropic and Claude that says, no, you can't get all of the copyright infringing material that you want when you brought in? And there's a lot of lawsuits, the New York Times lawsuit and others, but the guardrails have been adopted by the AI companies. So that's the division I think that's probably going to make the most sense, which is that if it's a collective problem, which you have lots and lots of people engaged in the activity and you can't hold them all individually responsible, then you're going to go upstream in those instances. And the law's doing that.
So I'm curious, maybe as the last question to the panel, and then we'll have the opportunity for audience questions, so start thinking about them. Is there anything about the technology or the circumstances in which the technology is being deployed that would change your opinion around how this will play out, whether it's capabilities of the technology, the functionality, like architecture? What would make you kind of stop and think twice?
Well, I do think that the case that Helen pointed out is underexplored. There are analogs in past law. I mean, you have like, if I have a pet tiger and I let it roam around the neighborhood, like, I'm pretty responsible, even though I didn't tell that tiger to do anything for what happens. And so, so we do have analogs in the law that are similar to that. And so, that are potentially similar to those types of conditions. But I do think that they need to be explored more, and to the extent that we see, in particular, to the extent that we see completely autonomous organizations that are not directed by humans, there will be a challenge in figuring out how to get legal remedies from them. But again, I think there are analogs to treasure that's sitting out there, and that we need to seize, because we need to make people who are harmed by somehow how that treasure was gotten whole. But we'll have to figure those out as they come up. That's the one area that I think is. The rest of it, I think, when you're talking about business to business, especially in some ways, assigning the liability in the first instance should be, the incentive should be as close to the harm as possible, I think. But a lot of this can also move contractually up and down the stack, and it will. Companies will develop sophisticated ways to share this, and then you'll have the whole insurance layer as well. So a lot of this is going to get worked out in a very specific way. I just worry about like freezing it into place through statutes immediately. I think this process needs to work out because of the variations in the types of liability and the types of harms that are happening. There's no single bullet here.
I just want to honor a complexity here, which is that the line between deployer and AI company is not crystal clear, right? Like these chatbots, as they are deployed and given to the public, I would argue is a deployment. That's a product, right? And so we can think sensibly about, did you do something wrong? Should you have done something more, right? Like very few people are using like raw pre-trained models for anything, right? And then to Neil's point, I do think there will be a role here for indemnification in companies that make a purpose-specific AI something and then say, if you use this for these purposes, I got your back, right? Like FICO indemnifies financial institutions that use their credit scores because FICO is confident in that analytic product, right? And so I think we will see layers of that happening in the future, which will be interesting.
Great. Well, let's open it up. Hot topic. Yes. There might be a mic that's roving, but I don't know if anyone is roving the mic. Yes, there we go. Right in the center, right there.
Thank you. My question is based on the principal agent theory and assessing liability. So if there's a developer and then there's a deployer, and if the AI agent goes outside the scope of the assigned duty, which was maybe in the developer and deployer contract, so are we going to dissect those contracts to assess liability, and what happens to the confidentiality of those contracts in litigation? Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to dissect those contracts. Yeah, I mean, that would be the natural thing you would do, right? If they exceeded authority, the person that wants to disclaim the responsibility will, of course, go to the contract and say they took on this as the agent and that they're the ones responsible for it.
And I would just add on that from the FTC's perspective as well, not just the contracts would be at issue, but sort of the public claims that the company made about what their agent was capable of doing, what it wouldn't do. If those are false or deceptive, then there can be an agency action as well.
Yeah, and I think that we're at a moment in time right now where I see a lot of companies, a lot of my clients are not taking a middle AI product that has been produced for them. They're making an API call directly to Gemini or Claude or, so people are going pretty right to the source and then trying to build their own workflows around that, right? And so I think in that setting, I tell them, no one's got your back here, right? Because you are taking an API call right into an LLM model that says in giant letters, this makes mistakes. Don't trust it to do anything, right? And so I think that will shake out in the next year or two. But I agree with Todd. If there's a contract that states capabilities and gives guarantees, yes, we'll scrutinize the hell out of that.
Yeah. Quick follow-up for Helen. One of the interesting new kind of affordances of these tools is that they do have some kind of chain of thought. Like, is that something that ought to be relied on in terms of what the agent was thinking as it was taking an action? Or like, how should people think about that dimension of the records that will be produced by these tools?
Oh gosh, I have no idea. I mean, I think when you can get access to the raw chain of thought, I do think that tells you something about how the agent reached its conclusions. It's certainly not perfectly reliable. Yeah, I think it's going to get very messy. I think it's going to be much more than contracts. I mean, I think we're starting to see already again, I think we're going to have a lot of agents doing a lot of things where it's not clear who the deployer is. For example, if they're using, open scaffolding in an open model, who's the deployer, not clear. Where the prompts, I think we're used to thinking of AI as being prompted in a window where we can see our prompt and we can read it because it's just a few hundred or a few thousand words. We now have agents with million token context windows that are writing skills for themselves that they can then send to other agents that will use to do different tasks and combine with other skills. So like, I think there's going to be really interesting new approaches that will be needed for understanding not just the chain of thought, but kind of the whole context window of sort of how did something happen, which, as you've emphasized, is going to be even more challenging because it's not a perfect representation. It sort of gives some evidence, but not perfect. I think it'll be really messy.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Hi, Rick Lane. I do child advocacy on tech policy. One of the questions about who's responsible when machines act is that we understand there's a lot of controversy around when machines are scraping data and the whole issue around copyright. One of the questions I've been wondering is if a machine is scraping sites that have CSAM, child sexual explicit material, and they're using that for training, and also using it as a product and incorporating it into that. There's 50 state laws on child pornography laws, as well as federal laws that say if you are knowingly facilitating this distribution of CSAM, or you have it on your servers, you're in violation of criminal law. So I'm wondering if you guys have put any thought into that and into that question. Thank you.
Can I? Yeah. I think Aaron answered that with the point of sector specific, there's going to be more obligations placed upon higher up the food chain, right? So if you're in a sector specific for CSAM, there's already a higher obligation and they're already aware of it. So I think that makes perfect sense that you're going to go sector specific with whatever the issue is. And CSAM would be one of those ones where, yes, the law is very aggressive for higher up the chain, and therefore there's more actions taken by them. And so when someone made the statement about AWS, do you want to hold them responsible? Yeah, in that instance, we do hold AWS responsible.
Does anyone on the panel know, I don't actually know the answer, what happened with the Lion data set and whether anything, so basically this has happened. There's a major data set called Lion that was found after it had been in use for years and years by researchers all over the place to contain CSAM. Did anything result from that? Have there been any charges? Has it been sort of treated as a good faith mistake? That's the best case I'm aware of.
And then I think the next question is, training so far has been at the discretion and direction of companies very clearly, or at least of like research collectives. Like there is talk of AI systems training AI systems, and so there could be then that question of like on whose account was that tasked, and were there relevant safeguards? But I think so far it's been a much simpler question.
I might just add one little nuance to that. If you want AI systems that can detect and therefore block CSAM, they need to know what it is. And so there are some instances in which I think there are complicated legal problems around this, but those tools could be very powerful to protect kids. And we need to make sure that that's possible in a safe way.
Yeah, it does seem like thinking about what narrow liability protections for certain actions might be needed in order to facilitate safety. For example, in fair credit context, there is a narrow protection for financial institutions to self-test their own models so that they don't create liability for themselves by trying to be aware of the risks, and what might that look that isn't overly expansive, but that would otherwise prevent kind of foresight activities to try and understand what might go wrong.
Can I make a very short point there? Another big incentive problem is no one wants to discover problems they don't know about, right? And one of the pitches that I make as like a half software engineer, half lawyer to my clients is, why don't we proactively look together? I'm your lawyer and this is underprivileged, right? But that's not something that everybody gets all the time. And so the disincentive to test is huge.
Yeah. In the back, yeah. Mike is coming.
Hello, Megan Gray. I totally agree with Aaron's point that so much of AI law is really reheated law from long traditional legal concepts, but a lot of it just doesn't seem to me to map well when you have the agent, the entity that is unleashing the agent being unable to provide a boundary around what that agent does or doesn't do. So concepts like meeting of the minds, force majeure, battle of the forms, just very basic concepts that we have to rely on in agency law, just don't seem to me to work well. And I was wondering if I'm wrong, if there's some case book out there that explains this to me that I could go look at.
Well, I think the answer really comes out of insurance, because that's the other layer of, the regulator here in many instances is going to be the insurance companies, right? So whether they're going to write a policy for not just the deployer but for the creator is really where there's going to be the regulatory issue, right? So they're going to disclaim all CSAM in any insurance piece, and that's still going to remain the responsibility of the AI company. But when you get to different issues that are come into that, that will be within the coverage or not. And the hard part is to determine whether they're going to issue insurance policies to small companies, right? Because the giants can self-insure, and everybody else is going to be in the position of how do we get our product out and can't get insurance for it.
Which is also going to require a good understanding of what sort of controls are actually useful in mitigating risks, so that that's conceivable to give a policy that's reasonably constrained. Other questions? Yes, up here in the front.
Thanks so much. So this has been done a lot in the privacy space, other spaces as well, perhaps, but folks are talking about contracts. I'm wondering about the extent to which Miranda, you or others have looked at terms and conditions so that of AI companies, both developers and deployers, to figure out the extent to which they can or perhaps already are trying to offload responsibility to the end user.
We haven't done that analysis. I don't know if anyone else has, but at the moment, I think the permissions that platforms typically grant themselves are capacious, and presuming that people aren't engaging with the very in-depth disclosures that are being provided. So certainly on privacy, there's I think a lot of risk of how the platforms and any other entities that they're engaging with through external tools or other types of plugins that they're bringing in around how that information is going to be shared, which can lead to all sorts of, I think, familiar types of harms. But in terms of the agency law side of it, I don't know if someone's looked at that quite yet, but I imagine it's something like you're responsible for the thing that you tell your tool to do. Yeah.
So I'm curious about purely the open source community and development process, and I want to know what are the risks that liability gets assigned in such a way that the open source community just realistically can't deal with that? And I think related to that, what happens when people maybe using pure open source environments build agents where they accidentally break the law, like collude in like financial investments or something like that? How do you even assign a liability when the user might not even be watching what the agent's doing?
Any thoughts?
I mean, I would really hope the open source community can thrive here, right? Which is, I think, part of the reason to be too cavalier about developer liability in the total abstract. Agents need something to spin their clock wheel, right? And so being an open source community, if you're doing things that create Helen's exceptional world of bots going crazy on the internet and teaching each other new religions and hacking people, maybe the open source community shouldn't be doing that winding up process, but training LLMs, offering models that other people can plug into and use, has an inertness to it that should help keep some liability at bay, right? That's not legal advice for any open source developers in the room. Come talk to me in more detail. But I think that there's to me, there's build something inert that other people can spin up and use is different than spinning up a bunch of agents that are supposed to do something that might cause harm.
Yeah, we have lots of software tools that are open source that can be misused in all sorts of ways and are. And it really, I think, the problem again is not the software development in the liability space. Often it's tracing, it's the tracking and tracing of who is actually causing the harm by using that tool. And that's a space in which I think we have some challenges, but the assigning liability for the harm is not really the big legal problem.
I mean, I'll tip my hand here a little bit and say that I think directionally, the only version of this that has made sense to me is to try and lean really hard on connecting any individual AI agent to a human user. And kind of regardless of what I said about, what if an agent is affected by two other agents posting about religion and then does something bad? I think ultimately, whichever person, I think the way you would want it to work would be whichever person ultimately spun up that specific agent should be the one on the hook. I think that'll just start looking very weird because the agents will do things that that person had absolutely no clue about. But I think there should be some standard of recklessness there related to the wild tiger, which should, in that case, kind of leave the open source community off the hook. I don't know if that's at all feasible in the way the law works, but conceptually, that's the only version that makes sense to me.
Any last questions? Another from Mary? Oh, actually, let's go to Nick in the corner in the front here.
Hi, Nick Garcia from Public Knowledge. I really love this example that Neil brought in of the wild tiger as a pet, because I think it brings into the conversation exactly something that Helen was also just referencing in terms of recklessness and basically old standards of liability, even then connecting back to Aaron talking about how these are things that are going to be dealt by older, more solid principles of law. We had laws regarding animals and things like that, which were non-deterministic actors that we used to live around quite a lot. We still have some rules for how to handle that from a liability perspective. It's funny that this evokes for me the kind of famous essay about law of the horse being like the wrong thing to think about, but here we may want to actually literally be looking at the law of the horse to help us understand AI liability. I'm wondering if there's more to that, or how we should think about that in relation to the deterministic or non-deterministic nature of AI systems.
I'll just throw out one brief thought that I found helpful here as a non-lawyer, which is, as I understand it, the way these liability standards often work is there can be sort of inherently hazardous activity that is treated that way when it's new and we don't know how it works yet and we don't have good guardrails. And then over time, an activity such as just letting your agent run wild on the internet maybe is at first treated as inherently hazardous, but then less so over time as it kind of gets better known. That was another analogy that I found interesting.
My only point on that would be that I think I might even agree with Helen on that sort of initial approach, but I would want it to be case by case in the courts. I think once you have a legislative standard for liability, that does not evolve, or at least it evolves much more slowly. And so the sort of relaxing that we would have there, you've already created a giant interest group around that liability standard, so very hard to change it over time. And so the law of the horse is a good example in that it is case-by-case tort law over time, not legislative structures that set the rules now.
I guess oh, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, in autonomous vehicles, we've set a standard, states do it, and federal government may do it, but autonomous vehicle production and deployment is following traditional law, but it's also sector specific. And I think that's where, we're all responsible for our children's activities, because they're always mostly foreseeable, even if we didn't expect them and we left the keys out and we knew they were drinking. The responsibility is going to go to the person that was in a recklessness standard. So I do think that the law is shaped to deal with this. There's a time lag. The insurance companies fill a huge part of that time lag, but that it does come.
That was going to be kind of my wrap-up question, which is, it's trite to say that this is all moving so fast and what do we do? But the law, these cases could take years to play out, to actually kind of go through a specific scenario and figure out exactly what happened. Insurance sounds like it might fill some gap. In the meantime, does anyone have a sense of what do we do in the meantime? Tools are being launched every 3 seconds. What we thought was true last week is not true this week. The trite statement is more real now than I think it used to be in terms of how fast this is all moving. So closing thoughts, where do we go from here?
I think my closing thought on that would be, let's not look at solving sort of short-term problems and ignoring the long term. And in the long term, we really want a system that can evolve along with the technology And to me, that suggests, I mean, the real answer is in the short term, like, there's gonna be a lot of lawyers looking at this and telling companies, like, we're not really 100% sure where the law's going here. It's in the evolution, and that evolution can't, like, shortcutting that evolution is short-sighted. And so I think we need people thinking hard about this. The companies need to be thinking about, like, what makes sense for their risk profiles. But that law, as it plays out, I think we don't want to shortcut that up front when we don't know enough yet. We still need to discover more.
As an individual, my what to do is just make sure your cyber defense is really top notch. Like, just protect your systems.
Yeah, I think my closing point, I mean, look, buckle up, right? That's really what this boils down to. But like, look, it's trite in DC to say that the technology is really fast and the law is slow. That's true, but the law is also a pretty cool general purpose technology unto itself, right? Autonomous vehicles, why do we have standards there? Because the AI started driving cars around the streets and it got really important and we sprung into action, right? And so I think there's gonna be a lot of change. This is very, very general purpose stuff, which is gonna make it hard for, as Neil says, overarching AI specific frameworks. And then, yeah, give me a call. Let's talk about it.
Todd, any last?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do think that the speed is different in this instance, and I go back to the bodega cat, which is in San Francisco, the cat that got run over by the Waymo, and their desire for everybody to go out and now regulate and stop Waymos from being in San Francisco. That's the type of thing where law can't do it, because when you legislate by anecdote, is where you run into the problems. And so I do think that but I can't answer the problem with the speed of this, which is different, I think, than any of the other things we've seen.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, panelists. This was great.
Thanks, Amanda.
Molt book is really weird.
Y'all ready to rock? Sweet. We'll always take when the room gets quiet as like the notice to start. Welcome everybody. My name is Luke Hogue. I'm the Director of Tech and Telecom Policy at the Foundation for American Innovation. I'll be moderating this wonderful conversation. I want to let my panelists introduce themselves in just a second, but I also want to note, if you go and look on the agenda, the description for this panel is very vague. So we're going to be covering a lot of territory and talking about a lot of stuff. And I think the general thesis is we want to talk about not only kind of case law in the First Amendment, but what does speech mean? How has it changed over time? How is it going to continue changing? So really looking forward to a wonderful conversation. I'll pass it over to Joel to let him introduce himself.
Hi, Joel Thayer, president of the Digital Progress Institute. I also serve as a senior fellow of AI at the American First Principles Institute. I know, it's been a long life. But I'm here more in my DPI capacity and like looking forward to this conversation. I like the framing.
Corbin?
Corbin Barthold. I'm Internet Policy Counsel at Tech Freedom. I'm also a member of TikTok's U.S. Content Advisory Council, and I am here in no capacity. Just
No capacity?
Say what I think. Yeah.
You're incapacitated.
Are you at least here in a physical capacity? Anyway,
individual.
Ash.
The ace role playing, yeah. Oh, hi. Do you want to try and say my name?
No, not really.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashkan Kazarian. I'm Senior Legal Fellow at the Future of Free Speech at Vanderbilt.
So I guess to kick us off, there's been a lot of conversation today and just in general. It is the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. It is not the 250th anniversary of the First Amendment, but we're going to kind of lump that all in together. It's the 30th anniversary of Section 230, and I thought there's no better place to start this conversation than way back in the beginning. And it's interesting because I'm currently working my way through Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. And there was a little anecdote that really struck me, where way back in 1776, there was a man named James Rivington who ran the New York Gazetteer, and he was a Tory in New York. As the Sons of Liberty and radical
more radical sides of the independence movement were getting going in New York. There was a mob that raided this man's newspaper and crashed and destroyed his ability to publish his newspaper because it was seen as being in line with the Tory cause. And at the time, Alexander Hamilton tried to stop this mob and later wrote to John Jay, quote, "In times of such commotion as the present, while the passions of men are worked up to an uncommon pitch, there is greater danger of fatal extremes." And I think this is a really interesting way to kind of think about what the founders were thinking at the time around the importance of the freedom of speech, the importance of what would become the First Amendment. And so I think a really good place to start this conversation is actually around what's changed? Like, what has changed since those original conversations were being had at, around the Declaration, around the constitutional conventions? So I guess just going down the line, I want to start with you, Joel. Since the founding, there's been a lot of changes in technology and changes in the ways that people speak and what speech really means. So how do you think and how do you conceive of the concept of how technology has changed what speech is, what it means, and how we conceive of that concept of speech?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I guess I think about it in three distinct buckets, and I like the original framing that you set up, which is that the concept of free speech is actually broader than whatever the First Amendment protects. And so if we were going back to like an originalist perspective, it gets far narrower if you like look at the actual historical or constitutional historical literature. So part of it is just like I think the latter debate on like the First Amendment and everything else will probably get resolved mostly at the Supreme Court level. I'm very interested to see how the court is grappling with this idea of originalism. Some of the things you brought up, like what did the framers actually think? You're seeing more citations to the Federalist Papers, like Federalist 44 has been cited quite a number of different opinions, but most prominently in the First Amendment context, you saw that with the the Free Speech Coalition, the Paxton case, in which the Free Speech Coalition was challenging a Texas law that age-gated pornography. But the other issue that you raised, I think, is very interesting. It's this evolution of technology and the mediums that have changed. And so I think the way I look at that is more or less a question like, is private censorship better or worse than a public censorship regime? And I think it can be demonstratively worse, as we've learned throughout the past like 10, 15 years. So to quote my good friend Gail Slater, I'm just as much concerned with tyranny.gov as I am tyranny.com. So there is that aspect of it. And I think in the third bucket is going back to like what the First Amendment actually means. I think the First Amendment, the text alone invites at least a historical review of what they were trying to do, what the framers actually thought, especially when you look at the precise text of what does abridging free speech actually mean. I mean, that implies that your free speech doesn't come from the government, it comes from something higher outside of positive law. I don't think it's any secret that the framers were pretty religious and they were evaluating issues on the natural law side of things. And so I think it comes down to what aspects of how can we look at what they were thinking about at the time and apply it to modern day. And it's a very interesting question that I undoubtedly will get teased through the appellate process. And I think you're already starting to see that.
Yeah, so Corbin, Joel brings up this word tyranny, and it's interesting because when I'm thinking about this context of that anecdote I just gave, right, that's the tyranny of a mob against, a newspaper, going in and people like literally like destroying the printing press. How do you think about these questions of speech and these questions of power kind of as they've evolved through technology from back in the day when you're literally like printing on pieces of paper to now when nobody uses paper anymore?
The technology has obviously changed dramatically, and that has changed the environment for speech. But I actually think we've come full circle. When I look back through American history, you mentioned a mob. John Jay got hit in the head with a rock. There's a lot of that kind of rough and tumble in Hamilton. It's a great book. I like to say Americans are not house trained. Philip Roth had the phrase, indigenous American berserk. Our speech environment has always been extremely sharp-elbowed and chaotic. Another thing that's fun in Hamilton is getting to read the letters of our leaders and how much they thought everything was going to pot and we were all going to tear each other apart, and that everybody on the other side was their mortal enemy. So we've always had a very wild, rough and tumble, aggressive speech environment. And we see that in the founding with all the scuttlebutt in papers, James Callender going around maligning the leaders of the country, sometimes actually quite accurately with their personal failings, and this concern about, we need to have high-minded civic debate. And no, we've really never had that. We've had people slandering each other in pamphlets from the very beginning. Thanks to technology, the way I view it is we actually had something of an interregnum in the second half of the 20th century where with the rise of technologies that were facilitating one-to-many speech, for about 10 seconds, we had a very uniform culture of speech around 3 broadcast stations, a probably monopolistic newspaper in your region, and a few radio stations and magazines, and that was it. A lot of the rough and tumble went away, a lot of concerns about corporate power in speech, and with recent developments, I actually see us coming back around full circle, where for all the fears about private censorship, we have a completely wide open, rough and tumble speech environment again. The rise of podcasters, the rise of alternative media with sites like Pirate Wires or Free Press or Compact, the rise of all the platforms we need to remember that are out there aside from the major ones we always think of, like Discord and Reddit and WhatsApp and Signal. A lot of the best conversations are currently occurring in Signal group chats.
As made evident by this administration.
Sorry?
As made evident by this administration.
Yes, this is true. So we actually, to me, things now, maybe just fortuitously by the way the technology has changed, we're back to a very similar environment to what the kind of stuff that the founders would have recognized. Things are quite open. We have, Martin Gurry's Revolt of the Public, where when information is abundant, it's very hard for anybody to speak with authority because the public is always capable of speaking back. And we see that on social media as well all the time.
So Ash, I'm curious if you agree with Corbin's assessment there that we've kind of come full circle. And then I guess a follow-up on that, assuming, I guess, whether or not you do agree with Corbin on that, is this question of how does this change how do you feel like our conception of perhaps not freedom of speech, but like specifically the First Amendment changed over time? Because, if we're kind of going back to those original ideas of the founding, it would seem like I would have a similar conception of freedom of speech now as they did then, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. So first, what do you think about
what? You asked me like 4 things. Let's go one by one.
Okay.
Let's go backwards.
There you go.
Great questions, though. I think the first one being that I think the current First Amendment, as we know it, wasn't there this whole time. That precedent, the body of precedent, mostly had developed, I would say, in the past 50. I'm like bad with math because I think I was born 10 years ago, but past 50, 60 years is when the meat of the First Amendment as we know it now has developed. Now, in my personal opinion, the current interpretation of the First Amendment, which is the strongest free speech protections in the world, is the right one, and the Supreme Court has come to it. But it wasn't always that, right? I do find it weird when sometimes people are like, oh, the First Amendment was always this great. It wasn't. We had come to it through different historical events and changing of the composition of the Supreme Court. I just do think that we ended up in the right place. Now, will we stay there or not is still a big question. So that's the answer to the first, actually the last question you asked. And then the one before that was, what was it?
I mean, do you agree with Corbin that that we've kind of come back full circle into this sense of that many-to-many speech, like we're back in kind of a Wild West for speech, if I'm kind of paraphrasing
Right.
Corbin here, but.
I think there are more mediums that we communicate through. So in a way, it is the most decentralized we've been in a while, and there are more opportunities. So while I do agree with Corbin, and he probably knows more about, actually he does for sure know more about history than I do, in my opinion, while we have kind of come back to more decentralized, right, like we have more forums for speech, I don't think it's the same as it was in like 1791, in the sense of like opportunities to express yourself and also possibilities to do so. But I think the principles and the mechanisms behind it are maybe similar.
So taking us a little bit out of the realm of kind of principles and into the more pragmatic, it's interesting that you bring up the idea of decentralization of speech. At the same time as we have radical decentralization of speech, it also sometimes feels like we have radical centralization, which leads to lots of questions around kind of platform governance decisions, and how these things these work. And I think nowhere have we seen this more concretely than in these questions around algorithms. And what are the algorithms doing? Are the algorithms speech themselves? Is it corporate speech? How do all these kind of come down? And I think one of the really interesting questions that I'm going to pitch this to you, Ash, first, and then kind of get the rest of the panel's opinions is are there distinctions that we're missing in these it seems like when we talk about the algorithms, it's just like this one big behemoth. But algorithms do a lot of different things. So are there distinctions that we're missing in some of these conversations around algorithms, specifically with regards to, is there a distinction between removing content versus suppressing content versus, labeling content and amplifying? Like, where are there distinctions that you think are important in some of these conversations?
I think practically, obviously, different types of algorithms doing different things, like suppressing content, amplifying content, are practically, in content governance sense, very different. But in my opinion, and maybe this is when it gets exciting for you guys, but in my opinion, I think when it comes to the legal side of things and the question of the First Amendment and other legal mechanisms surrounding it, they are just tools that platforms or individuals who are using algorithms use to exercise their editorial decisions and their editorial discretion. So in that sense, from that side, like if someone from a court bench is looking at it, I think it's the same.
So Joel, I'm going to come to you next because I think I'm going to assume that you have a little bit of a different take here than I think Ash does. What do you think about these questions around platform governance and where the line is between kind of governance decisions around content, corporate speech, and traditional, like the questions around power and speech?
Well, I think it's an incredibly important question, and I think it's a question. So, actually, I don't think I'll necessarily deviate too far from where I believe Ash is getting to, which is that there are these different concepts of speech, and the question I think that a lot of folks are grappling with is what's being communicated here, and what are the algorithms communicating to the extent they're communicating at all, and who has the speech interest? Again, I think that this. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the framing that yes, you can make the case that there are probably a lot more platforms, but there are choke points amongst all these platforms in which you have to work with at least some of them at some point. And the question is, are these, I hate to borrow this term because there's a better, I can't think of a better term, but there are these aspects of gatekeeping that does exist from whether or not you want to have a Discord on your phone that goes through either one of two app stores. If you want to have if you want to generate some ad revenue, well, there's only one of two ad exchanges that you can work with. So again, I think that there are these levers that are getting pulled in the background. So to the extent that there is these wider plethora of different platforms, as I don't know if that's all that meaningful in terms of the questions of speech. And if you're talking about an originalist perspective of like how we've thought about speech, I think that in the past 20 years, we've gone completely out of bounds in terms of like what the founders actually thought of these speech interests. And I think we're starting to get so I think I agree with Corbin in terms of the full circle, but I'm not sure if I agree with where we started, where we ended up. But I think where we're ending up is it's these different decentralization aspects or questions are leading us back to a fundamental question is like, what do we value? What do we want to protect? What is protected by law? What are the particularized speeches? And which is why you're getting a lot, I think, my opinion, far more sophisticated court decisions, at least at the appellate and the Supreme Court level, asking basic questions of, okay, so tell us what the speech interest is. Tell us, is this your speech? Is this someone else's speech? And then you couple that, I mean, I think it's a bit of providence that maybe not, maybe it's actually a reason why we started at this time, but I find it interesting we started talking at 2:30. And so you have these other aspects of like these statutory, I would call them government gifts, where, you know, they essentially allowed this untethered view of what a speech interest is, which basically amounted to, and I'll just, as trite as it might be, this almost like First Amendment Tourette's that we see from like the tech industry, where by virtue of adding an electron to a particular service, that there's an inherent speech interest, I think is completely ridiculous. So, and I think you're also starting to see that courts are responding to that, and they're asking very, very specific questions. The first question, in fact, in the TikTok case, that was which is where we tried to impose a foreign ownership obligation. We did impose a foreign ownership obligation onto a platform. The first question that Justice Thomas had to TikTok's counsel was, what precisely is your speech interest? And TikTok had a very difficult time explaining it. And I think that type of analysis is going to keep coming. Where I don't think the courts are buying this First Amendment wholesale defense, especially when you compare it to some of the other case law that you're seeing in Section 230 and how they're bringing those defenses in. So at what point, who is speaking? Why are you, or is it your speech? Is it the user's speech? Who actually has the right here, and who is the one that the law is determined to protect? And I think that's what's going to play out more and more as we get higher and higher up into the court system.
So I didn't think that we were going to get to Providence in this panel, but I guess that's my fault for bringing up Hamilton. I think
Rhode Island?
Corbin, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what Ash and Joel are saying here.
Good. I thought Providence was going to be some tech company that I hadn't heard of. Okay, you mean big picture Providence. I think Joel is right about the need to...
Thanks, everyone.
Parse, yeah, and we're done. The need to parse distinctions, and we might just come to different conclusions about what that process will lead to. So some of the concerns that people have once you scratch below the surface don't necessarily add up. So under current Supreme Court law, monopoly power for a certain editor, actually you maintain your First Amendment rights under Miami Herald versus Tornillo, which makes a lot of sense when you actually look at how fluid these markets tend to be and how quickly they move. If you get up to the level of having literal gatekeeper control, flip switch control over, say, a cable connection under Turner, we know, okay, there is eventually a point under, you become so powerful that a law regulating you might be subject only to intermediate scrutiny. I think in most of these contexts, plaintiffs
Not all of them are lawyers. What is intermediate scrutiny?
We look at the law and we are more likely to allow it to stand than we are if we apply strict scrutiny, which is what happens if you do a frontal attack on the First Amendment by saying we want to regulate the content of your speech or what you're allowed to say. I think it's going to be an uphill battle to show that kind of power with in any of these markets. We recently had the Facebook antitrust case, and I think a lot of people look at Facebook, for instance, and just it feels like it's super powerful, and then you do the market analysis, and well, I mean, Facebook hasn't been cool for a very long time, and so their market share is not actually that high, and so the antitrust case gets thrown out. The main thing I think people are interested in is algorithms on the actual expression-facing part, what they actually see. And we see this a lot where, yes, it's important to understand what the technology is or where the electrons are flowing, but what people ultimately care about is the expressive value at stake. And just because there's some kind of new technology doesn't mean that there's no expressive value. So another place I'll agree with you, I thought it was a catastrophe the way you had TikTok coming out and sort of giving their interests first in the Supreme Court oral argument, because the listener interest is much bigger. But the lawyer, Jeffrey Fisher, for trying to represent the interests of users came up second, and that interest got sort of buried in the case. So it may be the case that you don't feel sympathy for the speech rights of a particular speaker, and yet you still feel strongly that listeners have speech rights to have particular expressive products on the market, and that the second best world in which we live is still superior to letting the government seize those means of expression and take control over them. We have Moody versus Net Choice, so that's the Supreme Court saying that algorithms are protected by the First Amendment. We'll see where that goes. It was technically dicta in that decision, although I assume they will stand by it. It makes a lot of sense. There are infinite ways that you can use algorithms to send this message and not that. That is fundamentally expression. Maybe there's a problem to repeat if there's a certain level of market or gatekeeper power, but that threshold is going to be very high. And I would say what we need to do is maintain focus on people's right to a variety of different formats of information, different varieties of information. If they don't like the algorithms here, they can go and see them somewhere else. My one qualm with how that law has gone thus far is that Amy Coney Barrett wrote one of the most impactful, I hate that word, concurrences I've ever seen, where she said, well, what if the algorithm is just giving the user exactly what they want? Maybe there's no First Amendment right there. And I don't really see how that stands up. Even within the narrow universe of giving a user what they want, there are all kinds of expressive choices in terms of content moderation and trust and safety, things like avoiding spam. But then it's also that metaphysical concept falls apart. There are lots of different ways that you could give a person what they might want to see. There are various things that might, say, capture my interest. There's not one platonic feed that is the one I am most interested in. So even there, I think the importance of treating algorithms as expressive things remains important.
Just add a little bit of color to that. So, I think I mostly agree with one, or actually two caveats. On the Moody decision in particular, I think that, let's start with the Amy Coney Barrett, can I call it criticism? I'll just call it critique.
Dissent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your perspective of it. I think what that goes to is that there is actually this question of what the First Amendment is. It goes back to that original foundational question. Is the text of the First Amendment is the freedom of speech, not the freedom of listen. So there is an originalist perspective that does challenge the notion as to whether or not the listener themselves is entitled to X, Y, and Z. So I do think that there is some aspects of that. I don't want to put words or thoughts into Amy Coney Barrett or any other justice. Like, there are three minds I choose never to get into. One is my mom's, the other is Donald J. Trump's, and the last is a Supreme Court justice. But if I had to venture a guess, I think there is like this question of like what particular part of the algorithm that is the speech interest here. And so if you are requesting something, if you are doing mostly queries or responding to queries, that sounds, I think what I got the sense of Amy Coney Barrett, or Justice Barrett, trying to cabin this into more of a commercial speech context where it doesn't require as much rigor. On the other aspects of even reading the dicta from Moody in the broadest form. It only.
And what is dicta?
Sorry, dicta is non-binding precedent. So there's the actual binding part of the precedent that you can take to the bank. It's an instruction to all courts. This is what the law says. Dicta is like gives helpful context as to how they reach that decision, but is not something that you can rely on moving forward. So part of what I think Justice Kagan and those who agreed with her on the court were essentially saying was that, okay, yes, there are aspects of the algorithm that probably do warrant some protection, but it seemed pretty narrow. There was a lot of talks about news feeds and being able to curate news feeds, and there was also the actual overall design of the website itself, maybe having some expressive activity, but I don't think the court landed hard on algorithms entirely, especially when Justice Kagan cites to Amy Coney Barrett's concurrence in footnote 5. So I think, if anything, you can bet that the whatever the speech interest of the algorithm is going to be cabined by something I think we're all sort of getting around, which is what aspects of the algorithm are the speech, and I think that's what's really going to come down the pike here is that there's going to be a heavier analysis on what aspects of the service are you trying to regulate. Are you actually trying to get to the content? And even when you look at when you see that in comparison with the TikTok case, the question is, okay, well, is the overall purpose of the statute to get to the content, or are you trying to do something separate? And there's this ancillary effect that you have on the content, which the court is saying that doesn't immediately get you into content neutral. And there's even a question as to whether or not the First Amendment is applicable, even with respect to the TikTok case.
So I think it's really interesting because this is all discussion about current technologies, platforms that we've had for a long time, algorithms that we've been developing for decades. But this, I mean, it's been long held that code is speech in some capacity. I mean, we can debate exactly which part of the algorithm is speech and is not speech. But at least in my mind, like AI just completely upends this conversation and adds a new level of complexity. So I want to pass it to Ash and basically just ask, how should we even start to begin to think about the ways that AI systems kind of fit into this menagerie of distinctions?
Great word.
I think that's a very important question, and I don't know who has answered it yet. If anyone has, let me know.
Well, I'm asking you to answer it right now.
Yeah. We definitely, so far, I mean, there's Bernstein, right? That's how you pronounce it.
Yep.
There is a precedent that tells us that code is expressive, hence most code that is expressive is speech. But now, with all the technological developments, we are more veering into a territory where there are certain types of code that exist that probably don't have as many expressive features to it. But we haven't had any precedent that has dealt with that yet. So as far as I know, most of the code that exists that is making decisions about speech would be speech. But yes, I think it's a very new territory that no one, at least no one I know, wants to really veer into.
I'm asking you guys to veer into it, though.
Yeah.
Corbin?
Corbin?
So we have Supreme Court precedent saying if it's information, it's protected by the First Amendment. And that's Justice Alito, of all people, who made that clear. Code is information. It is a language. So the presumption probably we start with, it has some kind of First Amendment valence in itself. And that's before we get into, does it create a thing that's on the outside that is expressive in the eyes of a human? And one thing I should note, 303 Creative versus Alanus was this Supreme Court case a few terms back in which a website designer, it was about, well, does she have the freedom to not design a gay wedding website? And the state of Colorado said, look, no, it's a public accommodation law. We're actually making sure that people can't say, deny service to people based on their race or whatever. And that sounded like a very serious rejoinder. And the Supreme Court said, well, we're not looking at its code or whatever. The end product is a website that is expressive. We're going to get First Amendment protection on this. So I think that case will stand in the way of various attempts to try and get behind the expression and say, well, this is conduct in some way. The Supreme Court can do whatever it wants, so I'm not saying it won't happen, but it would look very result-oriented to keep 303 creative and then suddenly take a very different route in some other context. The question with the code then quickly becomes, well, the AI now are so good at making code that you can just have pure AI code, and things start to get kind of interesting. Joel mentioned or questioned the First Amendment right to receive information. I have not actually run that to ground as a matter of originalism. It's certainly true that our First Amendment case law is all modern. We didn't even get around to incorporating the First Amendment until the 20th century. Absolutely correct. And then it becomes a matter of, well, do you like the precedents or not? It is worth noting, there is a fulsome body of case law on your right to receive information. You can possess obscenity in the privacy of your own home. You can receive Communist Party propaganda if you want. So at the moment, that case law is really, really high. Again, Supreme Court can do whatever it wants. But if it's a matter of, it doesn't matter where the code came from, I, a human, want to receive it, under current case law, that continues to look like a very strong right. I think where things finally maybe get weird is, yes, okay, so if you have an AI making code some way that is talking to another AI, and it's not like Moltbook, like no human can see it, I think things start to get dicey, maybe, yeah?
We're definitely going to get to Moltbook here in a second and kind of agentic, because that's the next question. But I want to make sure that I understand kind of what you're saying here, Corbin. Or is what you're saying that kind of if we look at like this 303 case, and if we look at the right to receive information, that at least legally, it's the most important thing is actually kind of user outputs and less about kind of how the AI is designed? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, on an earlier panel about chatbots, there was talk about, oh, well, we should make the chatbots so that they don't act too human-like. And it rubbed me the wrong way a bit. I actually thought of the meme where, sorry to be terminally online for you all, but there's a man and a woman in bed, and the man says, I consent, and the woman says, I consent, and Jesus pops up behind them and says, I don't. What you do in the privacy of your own home, like, that's none of other people's business. What I do with a chatbot in my home is not other people's business. That's what the First Amendment right to receive information is all about. And my children, by the way, while I'm at it. So correct that that right, the point is that it is not the state's business what I think or what information I personally want to see. That is my right as a fulsome proponent of indigenous American berserk to do that on my own without a paternalistic regulation telling me what I can and cannot do in terms of receiving information.
I think this really proves that I'm also terminal online, but I've never seen that meme, which really says that algorithms are serving us things we need.
Well, I saw both Ash and Joel shake their heads when I asked that question, so I'll give you.
So I think fundamentally, if you're doing things in the privacy of your own home and it's legal, yeah, but I also think that we have plenty of precedent and laws where you can't use a chatbot, for instance, to hack someone. You certainly can't use it to engage in criminal activity.
To be clear, yes, but that's right. That's the conduct that you can't go out and do with code.
So
you can't use code to hack a
You're picking up what I'm throwing down. So I think that, again, it goes back to what the regulation actually is. What are you trying to do? And so this goes back to, in a very glib way, I said, tech has like this weird First Amendment Tourette's, where immediately some sort of restriction is immediately met with some sort of First Amendment defense, or there's somehow the action involved is imbued with something that the First Amendment actually does hold in revere. And I'm just not totally there. I think that I think it is true, however, that there are aspects of the algorithm that we have to look at and say, to your point on 303, and I think I agree. I just want to make sure if I mess anything up, well, Corbin, you're not shy. So In 303, the issue was the actual implementation, right? So the question was, look, from a public accommodation standpoint, it's pretty neutral, but the problem is the neutrality aspects of it amount to something that was tried to restrict you from doing something that's inherently expressive, like, for instance, making the choice of whether you want to serve this type of population or that population as a business. Yeah, okay, I can see in terms of an algorithmic change, if you're trying to manage the inputs at the front end and saying, hey, AI company, you are allowed to use input A, B, and C, but you can't use these other characters of the alphabet. All right, then I think at that point, that is the government doing this more paternalistic thing that you describe. However, if you were going back to that originalist perspective, and look, I don't know if they're going to do this. I think I'm reading the tea leaves as much as everyone else is. And the way it seems to be working out is that the question is, what precisely, I guess, like, I mean, what's that movie? Oh my gosh, I can't remember. Anyways, you'll get the meme when I say it. It's when the two Bobs are sitting across the table and they're asking, what precisely do you do here? Office space, thank you. Office space, yeah, I told you you'd get it. So I think that's kind of what you're seeing from the court. The court is sitting across from two Bobs and asking, or they're the Bobs asking either the plaintiffs or the defendants, what precisely is it that you are doing, and what precisely about this regulation impacts your ability to speak?
I really hope a justice takes you up and asks it in exactly that way.
So do I.
Bench at oral argument. Yeah.
Oh well, they did. Clarence Thomas did. I mentioned that one.
Can I ask you, first of all...
Didn't mention office space, though.
With the office
space.
Got it. In the tone of the guy. Yeah.
You and me both, brother.
What exactly do you do here?
Did you say First Amendment Tourette's? Did I understand that?
That's right.
Like the tick?
Correct.
Okay. I'm like still stuck. You said in the beginning that the Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton was like an originalist interpretation.
Yes.
Okay. So I have some of my former students who are not lawyers in the audience, so I know they don't know what originalism is.
I think y'all can debate originalism.
No, but like, originalism is like a constitutional interpretation, certain type of constitutional interpretation that Supreme Court can use, right?
Do you want me to clarify it?
No, I'm clarifying it for our audience before I ask you
okay.
the follow-up question is like, how do you see Free Speech Coalition v. Paxton as an originalist interpretation of the First Amendment?
I'm glad you asked. So if you look at how Clarence Thomas or Justice Thomas sets up the case, he doesn't simply say, oh, we're going to straight obscenity and we're going to only talk about the Miller test and we're only going to talk about whether or not Ginsburg applies for, and Ginsburg is a case where they applied rational basis on obscenity towards minors. And we're not going to, he didn't start there. He started with Federalist Papers 44, where he said, what is the actual constitutional right of the state? And the Federalist Papers 44 essentially argues that if the state is imbued with certain constitutional rights, then everything to remedy that right is swallowed into it. And so he basically created that framework to say, well, all right, does the state have the right to age gate certain products? And then he went through painstaking detail to describe every time we've applied age gating in the brick and mortar context. He didn't just limit it to obscenity. He talked about whether or not you were able to kids were able to buy pills over the counter at a CVS. He talked about the fact that you need to age gate gun licenses. Even for fundamental rights, we have age gating. And so what I gathered from that was, well, if the state already has this constitutional right, and citing Federalist 44 is a pretty good example, a pretty good indication that he's looking at the original founding. He's not consulting a case from 1980. My guess is that that's sort of like the type of analysis you're going to have to make. Like, what was it that the states have the right to do? And if they have the right to do it in a brick and mortar context, you have to demonstrate why they can't do it in a digital context. So that would be the originalist perspective. That's the originalist reading that I read into Paxton. And look, reasonable minds can disagree.
So we're going to open it up to Q&A here in just a little bit, but I do want to, I was originally going to say that you could do this either from like a lawyerly perspective or from like a first principles perspective, but I'm going to get rid of the lawyerly for a second.
Oh man.
So you brought up, Corbin, you brought up Moltbook. Raise your hand in this room if you've heard of Moltbook, you know what we're talking about here. Not quite enough to just roll with it. So Moltbook was essentially a system where people had AI agents that ended up creating, essentially, I'm oversimplifying here, they essentially ended up creating their own social media platform where AI agents were talking to each other. They created their own Reddit, essentially, where people could, and now you can go, if you're on your laptop right now, you can go look at Moltbook. But it presents this really interesting question from kind of a First Amendment free speech perspective of what do we do once robots start talking to each other? I mean, it's a very silly kind of way to phrase the question, but it actually is a very serious thing to start considering right now because we've already seen it in the wild. So I just kind of want to go down. Ash, if you want to go first, and we can just kind of go down.
Can I go last?
Yeah, you can go last. Okay. Like, how should we even start to think about this like weird, brave new world where we're going to have AI agents running around just talking and doing things for us? Does that simply break like our traditional perceptions of free speech in the First Amendment? Is there a really simple way to square all of this that I'm missing? Just want to throw that out there.
So you can okay boomer me if you want, but I typically think that the rights that we are given, the rights that the First Amendment protects is for humans, and not necessarily for robots talking. But if you were to make the case to say that there is like I mean, if you want to go broader and talk about like, well, does this actually advance a freer society and everything else? I think that escapes the bounds of what the First Amendment would protect. I don't think that the First Amendment, and I'm interested in anyone who's arguing that like two robots have that are imbued with a First Amendment right to have that conversation. I don't see it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But my initial take is that the First Amendment and the laws that are oriented towards either preserving or restricting certain access are more or less geared towards protecting the human condition, not necessarily the artificial condition.
Corbin, thoughts?
So things are moving very, very quickly. And I think from most people's perspective, it's gonna start getting very weird. So if I were on the Supreme Court, I would have no appetite to rush into this. I think I would put it into a few different buckets of when it comes to a human's right to receive the speech that's generated by AI, I've already made my point that I think that right should be pretty strong because it's not about the robot, it's about a human and my right to receive information and think about it and think about what I think about it. And I actually see no reason why speech that's generated from an AI should be treated with any less First Amendment protection than speech from the Chinese Communist Party. A genocidal regime sending its propaganda into the United States, you have a right to receive that. And so I think that's a strong right. People are going to have AI friends and AI relationships. Like, I know it sounds crazy, like that's just coming. And I think over the course of time, it will become normalized, but that will probably not be an immediate process. So if we dive into it now, I could definitely see there being Supreme Court precedents that say there's no right here and then it ends up getting overturned 20 years later or whatever. But as we sit here, I don't think there's any appetite to say, the AI itself has First Amendment rights. I think I have a right to see what those bots are saying to each other on Moltbook. The bots don't have any right to speak to each other. And then going back to Joel's point, what's obviously correct is I can't take a bot and have it go do something, and if it goes and sows chaos by breaking into a financial or whatever, like if I use the bot and do some kind of real world harm and violate a law, I have violated the law, should clearly be the rule.
I think legal norms come to a head when they actually are tested against what's going on in the world. And by that I mean if two bots are talking to each other and we are not aware of that, it doesn't really crystallize if they have First Amendment rights or not until someone tests that theory. And while I think we are in this like sci-fi world in our head, like thinking, oh, like it's just bots talking to each other, but how did these bots come to be? They're probably bots owned by two companies, or maybe even if it's two individuals. and those people have First Amendment rights. And we just talked about, right, like some case law that already exists, that code is speech. And so in my opinion, we won't, again, know until the courts test it, but two bots talking to each other, there's probably other speakers that are involved, right? Like there is the company that created the code that fed it the data that then, like, I don't know, like read all of Wikipedia and Reddit, and I don't know what's gonna happen if both of those merge, but, and now these bots, or like maybe it's a bot that read all of Wikipedia talking to a bot that read all of Reddit, and that can be a series. But like their First Amendment rights implemented in the company that decided what speech it fed and what data it fed to each of those that exist. So I think there actually probably is a First Amendment right if you just like encounter it.
Yeah, I think it's true. Like if Jackson Pollock can splatter a bunch of paint on the canvas and he doesn't know where it's going to drop or whatever, it's like, well, you didn't know where it was going to drop, and so now we have, well, I designed an AI chatbot. Well, what is it going to say? I don't know. There's a strong analogy there. I just wonder if that would actually hold up if we put it to the test in a court.
Yeah, well, look, I think we're all kind of circling the same wagon in that regard. Whereas, like, if there is a speech interest that's pretty narrow, I don't want to speak for you guys, but it sounds like you're talking about very specific things that actually do have originalist principles in it. So if anyone wants to see like true tenets of originalism, I mean, we have students here, as Ash has pointed out. There's a great essay by John Dickinson who helped draft a lot of the Constitution and was very influential. He came up with like 3 basic tenets of like what the First Amendment ought to protect. And so part of it, like to your Jackson Pollock piece, which I really appreciated, is that, you know, there is like this question of what the First Amendment was ultimately there to advance truth. And also to advance the arts, and also to help investigate certain things. So I think if there are things in that regard, what I'm seeing is that AI really is asking a lot of us to challenge our first principles and challenge our priors, and also challenge, as a country, what do we want to preserve, what do we want to protect? I'm seeing some obvious things, like parental rights are becoming more and more of an issue, and that is a fundamental right. You're starting to see a lot of that play out, and also when it comes to the pushback that I think that Corbin was alluding to, you're seeing that balancing test of the First Amendment right of the child versus like the parental right of whether the right to parent and the AI's relationship in between that. But you're also seeing this question of like, okay, what aspects of this AI machine is going to promote and advance this concept of human flourishing, and whatever that means to anyone else. I mean, that's an ongoing debate. But I think ultimately that's where, if you wanted like a legal high level legal philosophy here, I would really recommend reading some of the initial conversations that you saw when the framers were developing the First Amendment. And can I point to one more thing, and then I'll pass it over to you? I guess I'll just do it. Another thing I would look to too, if you really want to get a sense of what they were worrying about, you look at the Virginia legislator and the 2 reports on the Sedition Act, where you have the majority report that was written by James Madison, and then you have the minority report that was written by, well, we think, because like it was anonymous, but it's strong John Marshall vibes. And like these 2 disagreed, and they vehemently fought. They agreed on basic principles, but they fought on the tenets. So I think if you want to see a sense of like what we want out of what we might look to, or what the court might look to, if they're taking an originalist train, it would probably be that, and maybe even like looking at some John Dickinson.
Cool. Well, we're going to open it up now for Q&A. We've got time for probably 2 or 3 questions. So, yep, right in the back.
Hi, I have a question and a predicate, but not in that order.
No filibusters.
Yes, I'm Adam Eisgrad with the Chamber of Progress, and I run a campaign called Generate and Create, which, for reasons that will be obvious in a moment, is pro-fair use in copyright law. The question is, what do you think? The predicate is, in this panel on the First Amendment, because it's not complicated enough, I figured I'd mention all this. Fair use is a safety valve in copyright law that the Supreme Court has observed, among other exceptions, is extremely important, or all of copyright law could be so restrictive as to preclude speech, as to violate the First Amendment. So it's a critical safety valve from a First Amendment perspective in keeping the copyright ecosystem vital. The question, what do you think? And about what's going on currently with disputes over AI training, to which fair use is a defense in copyright law.
just down the line, or?
Yeah, sure. Anyone want to take that?
So I think the concept of fair use has been pretty amorphous, right? And so it's not necessarily like, although there are codified doctrines of fair use that you can basically apply, I think the courts are basically ferreting a lot of that stuff out now. I don't know if there's necessarily a need to have any individual regulator say this is what fair use is or codifying it or not. I think the courts are basically landing on something that I think is pretty reasonable, which is like, look, if you are going to have something on the internet that is not protected by not password protected, don't go beyond that. If you go beyond that, then maybe you might have a copyright claim. But I think this is going to be beaten out in the courts as it always has been, especially when it comes to copyright issues, because I'm sure, as you know, at Chamber of Progress, trying to do anything like rewriting the DMCA, for instance, is basically a non-starter for at least this Congress. So my instinct is that it's probably going to go, I think a lot of courts are grappling with this. I think they're coming out to the basically good result, simply saying don't go beyond paywalls and making sure that and also articulating what the right is. So that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but that's my take.
Anyone else? Corbin?
Yeah, I have enough First Amendment stuff to worry about without lobbing copyright bombs. So I'm pretty.
Do it anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm sympathetic to the view that if you lawfully obtain information and feed it into the training, that's fair use. If the thing proceeds to spit out an exact New York Times article, that is not. And that, as Joel says, the courts will figure it out and hopefully come to something around that equilibrium.
We don't do IP. I'm so glad we don't. So I will just say, I think what we haven't really grappled with when we talk about AI and fair use and in general regulation of chatbots is that we still don't have a federal privacy law that should figure out how much of our data is getting swept up. And those of you in the audience who work in Congress should do something about it.
Next question. We've got one hand over here.
Hello, everyone. James Irwin with Americans for Tax Reform. I believe I'm known to most of the panelists. But Ash, you mentioned free speech rights extending from whoever programmed the bot or built the bot that built the bot, whatever, to the bot itself. And Corbin, you sort of grazed but did not penetrate this issue. We talked about Section 230 liability protections. How do you see that applying in the future to the content produced by AI chatbots, and sort of in the context of what you were alluding to earlier? Feel free to just run with that. It's not a very specific question, I know, but.
The guys who wrote Section 230 did tell us they don't think Section 230 applies to speech produced by the chatbots. Doesn't mean that's like the highest authority, because court can interpret it differently. I think when it comes to chatbot generated speech, if it turns into user speech in some way, shape, or form, it becomes protected. Or like, let's say you go into a chatbot and you give a chatbot such a specific command of, give me a paragraph of an article about the Beatles from Wikipedia. I'm sorry, you were sitting in front of me. From Wikipedia and the top Wikipedia Beatles subreddit. And then because it's like third-party speech that chatbot just ciphered as a tool, probably is also protected by 230, but I think most of it isn't. And the courts are currently I know we've said that a lot, but the courts are currently working out through that.
Yeah, no, I think there are isolated instances where Section 230 might apply. Funnily enough, those would be the instances where they'd be violating copyright, which Section 230 wouldn't protect, so they wouldn't want to do it anyway. But in the vast majority of cases, I don't think Section 230 protects what an AI puts out.
I agree.
Sorry, as a prudential matter, should it, though? Should there be something?
Can I answer that? I think actually what you're starting to see, I think the AI companies understanding that, or having that general understanding that Section 230 as it applies, is actually doing a lot in terms of good corporate governance. So you actually see OpenAI now openly saying, "Hey, we'll age gate our own products. We'll make sure that kids are protected." And they're not so. I think, and part of that, again, I don't want to get in the minds of a corporation or who's making those decisions, but I think by virtue of it not being present, you are getting better results from corporates. So if that trend seems to continue, I don't really like recreating the same mistakes that, well, in my view, that we made in Web 2.0 and transplanting them over to Web 3.0. So as a first principle, I would think that would be a very bad decision.
Well, if we go any longer, Gracie back there is probably going to throw something at me. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to State Internet for being such a wonderful and gracious host. And thank you to all three of our panelists for sharing your expertise today.